She stepped off the train with her hand already lifted to wave, and the man walking toward her wasn't the one she'd come to marry. "You're lying," Marjorie Hale gasped, gripping his coat. "Say you're lying to me. Say it." Simon Harper didn't pull away. "Ma'am, I wish to God I was." 2,000 miles she'd crossed for Wendell Harper. Everything she owned. A heart she'd handed to a man through ink and paper. And he'd been dead a week before her train ever pulled in. If a woman who crossed 2,000 miles for a love that died before she arrived is your kind of story, comment the city you're watching from right now. I want to see how far Marjorie travels tonight. Subscribe, and stay with me to the very last word. She stepped off the train with her hand already lifted to wave, and the man walking toward her wasn't the one she'd come to marry. Marjorie Hale had rehearsed this moment for 11 days. 11 days of Prairie sliding past a smeared window of stale bread and colder coffee of a wedding dress folded flat in the bottom of a trunk she couldn't afford to check twice. She had practiced her first words to Wendell Harper until they wore smooth as a river stone. She would say them plain. She would not weep. She would let him see the woman behind the letters, and she would let him decide. But the man crossing the platform toward her walked like a man carrying something heavy in his chest, and Wendell Harper had written her that he walked light. "Miss Hale." The stranger stopped 3 feet short of her hat, already in his hands. "Miss Marjorie Hale." "Yes." Her waving hand came down slow. "I'm looking for—" "I know who you're looking for." He turned the hat brim in his fingers around and around. "I'm Simon Harper, Wendell's brother." She waited for the rest. For the apology that Wendell was late or sick or hiding too shy to come himself after all those months of ink. She had prepared for every version of him, but this one, this silence, this brother with grief sitting on his shoulders, like a second coat. "Where is he?" she asked. Simon Harper didn't answer. He looked at the trunk by her feet. He looked at the dress collar, buttoned to her throat, at the traveling gloves she'd mended twice on the train, so they'd look decent when Wendell saw them. "Miss Hale," he said, "I need you to sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I've been sitting 11 days. A laugh got loose from her before she could stop it, thin and wrong. "Where is your brother, Mr. Harper? There was an accident." He said it quiet, the way a man says a thing he's already said too many times inside his own head. "On the ranch. A week ago Tuesday. His horse went down in the wash, and he went with it." The platform kept moving around her. Porters shouting, a woman scolding a child, iron wheels hissing steam. All of it went on like nothing had happened, like the whole world hadn't just tipped sideways and spilled her out. "No," Marjorie said. "Ma'am, no. He wrote me. He wrote me from the depot in Kansas City. He said he'd have the wagon by Thursday." Her voice climbed and she couldn't get it back down. "You've made a mistake. There's another Harper. There's some other—" "There's no other Harper." Simon's jaw worked. "It was me carried him in. I buried him myself, Miss Hale. Him and me and old Amos Teal, we buried him behind the house under the cottonwood 3 days before your train ever left the east." Her knees didn't buckle. That was the strange part she'd remember later. She'd read in novels how a woman folded at news like this, and she did not fold. She stood there on that platform with her mended gloves and her buttoned collar, and she felt the future she'd crossed a continent for go out like a lamp. "I gave up my room," she heard herself say. "I sold my mother's sewing table. I sold everything. I have—" She looked down at the small purse tied at her wrist, and she knew what was in it to the penny. "I have $4.60. Simon Harper closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he'd made some decision she couldn't read. "Then you'd best come with me," he said, "before that $4 has to buy you supper too." But she didn't move. She couldn't. And into that stillness, the platform crowd pressed closer the way crowds do when there's a scene to be had, and Marjorie heard the whispers start before she saw the faces they came from. "That's her. That's the gal Harper sent for." Lord, no wonder he had to send away for one, but did he have to send for the whole? "Hush," She'll hear you. Let her hear. Woman that size crossing the country after a rancher she never laid eyes on. Marjorie's face went hot. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in church pews and dry goods stores her whole life, the low music of women deciding what she was worth by the width of her. She fixed her eyes on the boards at her feet and made herself small, made herself a wall, the way she'd learned to do when she was a girl. But Simon Harper turned. He turned slow, and he put himself square between Marjorie and the crowd, and when he spoke, he didn't raise his voice 1 inch, which somehow made it carry farther than a shout. "This here is Miss Marjorie Hale," he said. "She come 2,000 miles at my brother's invitation, and my brother is a week in the ground, and she just now learned it standing on this platform in front of every gaping fool in Wheeler's Crossing." His eyes moved across them one by one. "Now, any man or woman here got something to say about her, you say it to me. And you best say it kind, because she's a guest of the Harper family, and the Harpers have buried enough this month without burying their manners too." The whispers died. A woman near the front had the grace to look ashamed. A man tipped his hat and turned away. And Marjorie, who had spent 34 years wishing the ground would open whenever the whispering started, lifted her eyes off the boards for the first time and looked at the back of the stranger who'd stepped between her and the world. She didn't know it yet, but that was the first thing Simon Harper ever gave her that his brother's name wasn't signed to. If you're watching this, do me a kindness comment, the city you're sitting in right now, so I can see just how far Marjorie's story travels tonight. And if a woman who crossed 2,000 miles for a love that died a week before she arrived is the kind of story that keeps you up till the last word, subscribe, and stay with me clear to the end. Because what Marjorie found in Wheeler's Crossing wasn't the grave she expected. It was a secret. She did not remember getting into the wagon. She remembered her gloved hands in her lap and Simon Harper's back straight as a fence post, and the reins loose in his fingers, and the long silence between them that neither one knew how to break. "You must think me a fool," Marjorie said at last. "A grown woman crossing the country for a man from an advertisement. I saw how those people on the platform looked at me. I'm used to it. But you must be thinking it too." "I don't think it. You can say it. I've heard it all my life." "Miss Hale." Simon kept his eyes on the road. "My brother put an advertisement in a Kansas City paper and got 40 answers. 40 women wrote back, and he read every one, and he chose yours, and you want to know why. Because I was the only one desperate enough to. Because you wrote about a book," Simon said. "The others wrote about their cooking and their needlework, and how many sons they'd give him. You wrote about a book you'd read till the spine broke, and you asked him what he read on the long nights, and whether a man could be lonesome with 100 head of cattle to keep him company." His jaw tightened. There wasn't another letter in that whole stack worth the paper it took. Yours a man could read 100 times over. Marjorie stared at the side of his face. "How do you know what the other letters said?" Simon Harper did not answer right away. "Wendell told me," he said. "Wendell told me everything. We were close, my brother and me." And Marjorie, who had no reason yet to hear the crack running under those words, only nodded and looked away. "I'm glad he had that. Someone to tell things to. He wrote me it was a lonely country." "It is," Simon said. "It surely is. You hungry?" he asked a mile out of town. "No." "You will be." They rode another mile. "He talk about me?" Simon asked. "In the letters. Did Wendell mention he had a brother?" Marjorie searched. 11 months of letters, and she had read every one until the folds went soft, until the ink smudged from her thumb. She could recite whole paragraphs. She knew the man who wrote them the way you know a hymn. "He mentioned a brother once," she said slowly. "He said he had a younger brother who was clever with books. He said—" She stopped because the memory came with a sudden ache. "He said his brother had the words he never could keep hold of." Simon Harper's hands tightened on the reins. Just for a second. She didn't notice, or she noticed and thought it was the road. "That's so," he said. "That's true enough. He wrote beautifully." She hadn't meant to say it. It came out of her like blood from a cut. "Your brother. I don't think you understand what his letters were to me, Mr. Harper. Where I come from, no man ever wrote me a word. No man ever looked at me twice on account of—" She lifted a hand and let it fall, meaning her whole self, the size of her, the plainness of her. And your brother, he never once asked about my face. He asked what I dreamed about. He asked, was I lonely? He noticed things about my mind that I didn't know a soul had ever seen. Simon Harper said nothing. His profile had gone hard as carved wood. I know how it sounds. Marjorie went on, and now she couldn't stop 11 days of held breath coming loose. A grown woman, 34 years old, in love with a man from paper. My sister told me I'd lost my senses. She said a rancher 2,000 miles off could write me anything he pleased, that men lie in letters, same as they lie in beds. And I told her. Her voice cracked clean through. I told her a man doesn't write like that unless he means it. A man doesn't notice a woman's soul unless he's got a good one himself. And I was right, Mr. Harper. I was right, and now he's dead, and I don't even have $4 to grieve him properly. She turned her face away from him, then toward the open country she couldn't have described. If you paid her. And Simon Harper drove the rest of the way, with his mouth pressed shut, and something terrible moving behind his eyes. The ranch, when they came to it, was smaller than she'd built it in her mind. A low house, a barn, a corral, with 3 horses that lifted their heads at the wagon. A dog came off the porch, stiff-legged and old, and Simon spoke to it low, and it settled. It ain't much, Simon said. Wendell always meant to add rooms, for when you came. The kindness of it for when you came nearly took her legs from under her. She gripped the side of the wagon. I can't stay here, she said. I can't stay in a dead man's house. Where else you aiming to go, Miss Hale? $4 won't buy you back east. Won't buy you a week at the boarding house in town. And I'll tell you plain, Mrs. Pruitt, who runs it, don't take charity cases, and she'd size you for one by supper time. Simon set the brake. There's a room. It was to be yours regardless. You'll sleep in it tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure the rest, and no man in this valley will say one word against it, or he'll answer to me. He came around and offered his hand to help her down, and she looked at it. The calluses, the split knuckle, the strength of it, and for one strange lurching moment, she thought, this is the hand that buried the man I loved. She took it. She climbed down, and she went into the house of the man she'd come to marry on the arm of the brother who'd put him in the ground. That first night, she did not sleep. She lay in the narrow room that was to have been hers, their room once she supposed in some version of things that would now never come, and she listened to the unfamiliar house settle and creak, and she pressed the packet of letters against her chest with both hands. She had carried them the whole way in her traveling case tied with a blue ribbon, and now they were all she had left of him. 41 letters. She'd counted them so many times she could have told you which envelope was thinnest. Through the wall, she heard Simon Harper moving, heard a chair scrape, heard once low and rough a sound she couldn't be sure of. But that might have been a man crying who didn't want to be heard. She thought he lost a brother. She thought I lost a whole life. And she thought with a bitterness that shamed her even as it rose, at least he got to know the man. At least he had years of him. I had paper. In the morning, she came out to the kitchen at first light because a lifetime of poverty had taught her that a woman who cannot pay her way had better make herself useful, and useful started before the men woke. But Simon Harper was already there, already had the fire going, already had coffee on. You didn't have to, she said. I've been rising before the sun since I was 9. He set a cup in front of her without asking. Sit. Eat. You're gray as ash. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She did not drink. I need to ask you something, Mr. Harper, and I need you to tell me straight. She lifted her eyes to his. Was he happy when I was coming? Did he want me truly? Or was it just that a man out here needs a wife the way he needs a plow, and I was the one who answered the advertisement? Simon Harper stood very still by the stove. Because I've had all night to think, Marjorie said, and her voice was steady. Now steadier than it had been since the platform, the steadiness of a woman who has decided to know the worst. I've had all night to wonder if the man in those letters was ever real at all. If maybe I built him out of my own wanting. And I'd rather hear it from you than lie to myself another minute. For a long moment, Simon didn't speak. And when he did, his voice came out strange and careful, like a man walking on ice he already knows is thin. "The man in those letters wanted you," he said. "I can swear to that. On my brother's grave, I can swear the man who wrote those letters wanted you more than anything on this earth." Something in the way he said it made her look at him twice. But grief makes a fog of everything, and she was too deep in her own to read what was standing right in front of her. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's thank you." He turned back to the stove so she wouldn't see his face. The days that followed folded into one another. Marjorie made herself useful because it was the only thing that kept her upright. She cooked, she mended, she scrubbed the plank floors of a house that had waited to be a home. And Simon Harper let her, because he seemed to understand that idleness would kill her faster than grief, and because she began to notice he could hardly bear to look at her. She took it for guilt. The brother who'd survived, ashamed to be alive in front of the woman his brother had left widowed before the wedding. It was a natural thing, she thought. It would ease with time. It did not ease. On the second day, Simon hitched the wagon and told her they were going to town, that a house needed flour and salt, and she needed cloth if she was staying even a week, and he'd not have it said the Harpers let a guest go without. "I don't need cloth," Marjorie said. "I don't need charity, Mr. Harper. It ain't charity to feed a body under your roof." He handed her up onto the seat. "And it ain't cloth for a dress. It's cloth for curtains. That kitchen window's been bare since Mama passed, and it's about time somebody dressed it. You'll be doing me the favor." She knew it for the kindness it was, and let him have it. The moment the wagon rolled into Wheeler's Crossing, Marjorie felt the eyes. She'd felt them on the platform, and she felt them now tracking her from doorways, from the mercantile porch, from behind the wavy glass of the milliner's shop. "Don't pay them any mind," Simon said low, not looking at her. "I've had practice." Inside the mercantile, a woman in a stiff gray dress stood at the counter, Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the boarding house, and the town's opinions in equal measure. She looked Marjorie up and down with a slow, deliberate insolence. "So this is the correspondence bride." Mrs. Pruitt said the word correspondence like it had gone off in the sun. "Come all this way, and poor Wendell not even cold in the ground." She clucked her tongue. "Some folks might call that unseemly, Mr. Harper. A strange woman living out at your place. No wedding, no chaperone. People will talk." "People are talking right now, Mrs. Pruitt." Simon set his list on the counter. "I can hear them plain. I only mean to spare the poor thing embarrassment." The woman's smile was a blade. "Though I don't suppose a woman who'd travel clear across a continent chasing a man she'd never once laid eyes on has a great deal of shame left over to spare. Why, in my day, a woman knew her place, and her place was not 2 yards of the blue gingham," Simon said, cutting clean across her, "and the white bolt there for curtains. And you'll wrap it, and you'll ring it, and you'll keep your day to yourself, ma'am, on account of nobody in this store asked after it." The place went quiet. The clerk's eyes went wide as saucers. Mrs. Pruitt drew herself up. "Well, I never." "No," Simon said. "I don't reckon you ever did. That's the whole trouble with you, Mrs. Pruitt. You never once in your life crossed a street for love, let alone a country. So you can't tell the difference between a woman with no shame and a woman with more courage in her than this whole town's got put together. Miss Hale's got the courage. You've got the mouth. Good day to you." He picked up the wrapped cloth, took Marjorie's arm, and walked her out into the street, with his head up, and behind them, the mercantile burst into a hive of scandalized whispering, and Marjorie Hale walked out through the middle of it on Simon Harper's arm, and did not, for the first time, she could remember, feel the width of herself at all. At the wagon, he handed her up. She was quiet a long moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "She'll only make it worse now. She'll tell it up and down the valley by Sunday. Let her." Simon climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. "A man who won't stand for a guest under his roof ain't worth the roof over him." He clucked to the horses. Wendell would have done the same. He couldn't have said it as pretty, maybe, but he'd have stood. And Marjorie, who did not yet know that the pretty saying was the whole and only difference between the two brothers, and that the difference was the very thing she had fallen in love with, smiled for the first time since the platform. "You have a way with words when you're riled, Mr. Harper," she said. Simon Harper's hands went still on the reins for just a moment. "Do I?" he said. "You do." He didn't answer that. He clucked to the horses again, and they rolled out of town, and he did not look at her the whole way home. That third evening, Marjorie couldn't sleep, and she came out to the kitchen to find Simon at the table, with a book open in front of him and the old dog stretched at his feet. "You read," she said. It came out before she could think. He closed the book, almost guilty about it. "Some, when the work's done. Amos hadn't come by yet, but I'd have wagered it anyhow." She sat down across from him without asking because grief had worn away her patience for standing on ceremony. "You've got the look of a man who reads. Wendell never took to it, I suppose. Wendell had better things in his hands than books." Simon's thumb moved on the cover. "He could look at a horse and tell you its whole life. Could smell weather 3 days off. New things I'll never learn if I read 1,000 of these." He almost smiled. "We each got the half of it we needed, I always figured. He got the doing. I got the—" He stopped. "The saying." Marjorie finished softly. Something crossed his face. "I suppose." She looked at the book. "What is it?" He turned it so she could see the spine, a volume of poems old and much handled. "I know that book," she said, and her breath caught because she did know it. "There's a poem in there about a traveler and a light in a window. About coming home to a place you've never been." She looked up at him. "Wendell wrote me about that very poem, in a letter. He said it made him think of me coming west. He said—" Her voice trembled. "He said I was the light in the window before he'd ever laid eyes on it." Simon Harper sat very, very still. "Did he?" Simon said. "He wrote it so beautifully." Marjorie pressed her hand flat on the table. "I've read that letter 100 times over. It always did surprise me that a rancher out here would carry poetry like that in his head. But I thought that's the mystery of a person, isn't it? You never know what a soul's been holding on to till it opens up to you." "No," Simon said, and his voice had gone strange and low. "You don't." She thought he was only moved. She thought the mention of his dead brother's tenderness had touched him, and she felt a rush of warmth toward this quiet man, who grieved so hard he could scarcely speak of it. She reached across the table, she didn't plan it, and laid her hand over his for one moment. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me about him, about the doing and the saying. It helps me to know him better, the real man behind the letters." Simon Harper looked down at her hand resting on his. And for one terrible moment, she saw something move in his face that she had no name for, that she would only understand much later was a man being handed the one thing he wanted most in the world, under a name that damned him for wanting it at all. He drew his hand back slow. "You ought to sleep," he said, and stood up too fast, and the chair scraped, and the dog lifted its head. "Good night, Miss Hale." And he was gone into the dark of the house before she could answer, and Marjorie sat alone at the table with the book of poems, and did not understand not yet why a plain word of thanks had sent him away from her like a man walking out of a fire. On the 4th day, Amos Teal came by the old hand who'd helped bury Wendell and Marjorie, brought him coffee on the porch, and sat with him while Simon mended a length of fence beyond the corral. "You're the letter gal," Amos said, squinting at her. He was ancient sun-cured, missing most of one ear. "The one from back east." "I am." "Terrible thing." He shook his head. "Terrible. Wendell weren't but 40. Strong as a bull, that boy. Never seen a man ride like him." He slurped his coffee. "Funny thing, though." "What's funny?" "Him writing you all them letters." Amos chuckled a dry rattling sound. "Wendell Harper couldn't spell his own name most days. Boy could rope, boy could ride, boy could break a horse, nobody else'd touch. But letters," he wheezed. "I seen him sign a bill of sale once. Took him a full minute, and it come out looking like a chicken walked through ink." The coffee cup stopped halfway to Marjorie's mouth. "That's not—" She set it down. "That can't be right. Wendell wrote me 41 letters, Mr. Teal, pages long. He wrote me poetry once. He quoted scripture. He—" Amos scratched at his ruined ear. "Well, Reckon a man can surprise you. But he was frowning now, working at something in his slow old mind. Only I'd have swore. I knowed that boy 30 years. Weren't no scholar in him. His daddy pulled him out of the schoolhouse at 8 to work the herd. He shook his head again. Now the young one, Simon, that's a different animal. That boy reads. Got a whole shelf of books in there. Their mama, God rest her, she taught Simon his letters proper before she passed, and he took to it. Wendell, he'd have rather eaten dirt than sit still with a book. Across the yard, Simon Harper straightened up from the fence. He was too far to hear. But something in the set of Marjorie's shoulders, some stillness that had come over her, made him drop his hammer and start walking toward the porch. "Mr. Teal," Marjorie said very quietly. "You're certain of this?" "Certain as I'm sitting here." The old man had no idea what he'd done. "Why, I remember Wendell coming to town a year back, all worked up. Said he'd found a gal through one of them mail advertisements, but he couldn't figure how to answer her. Said he was going to get Simon to—" "Amos." Simon's voice cut across the yard sharp as a whip crack. He'd covered the distance faster than she'd thought a man could. "That fence ain't going to mend itself. You want to earn that coffee, or you want to sit there running your mouth?" The old man startled, then grinned oblivious. "Just keeping the lady company, Simon. The lady's got work of her own." Simon's eyes met Marjorie's, and what she saw in them turned her cold. Because it wasn't confusion. It wasn't grief. It was fear. Naked, cornered fear, the fear of a man who has heard the first stone come loose from the top of a wall. Amos heaved himself up, muttering, and shuffled off toward the fence, and Marjorie Hale sat on the porch of a dead man's house, with a coffee cup gone cold in her hands, and looked up at Simon Harper and asked him the question that would break the world open. Who wrote the letters? Miss Hale. Who wrote them? She was on her feet now. She didn't remember rising. "Wendell couldn't spell his own name. Your own hand told me. And you—" Her breath came fast. "You knew what was in them. You knew in the wagon when I said he noticed my soul, you went white as a sheet. And this morning, the other morning, you swore to me on his grave that the man who wrote those letters wanted me. You didn't say Wendell. You said the man who wrote those letters. I heard it, and I told myself I was imagining." Marjorie. It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. It stopped her like a hand on the chest. "Sit down," Simon Harper said, "please, and I'll tell you everything. Every last piece of it, God help me. But you're going to want to be sitting when I do." She did not sit. "You wrote them," she said. It was not a question anymore. Simon Harper looked at her. This woman who had crossed a continent, who had sold her mother's sewing table, who had buttoned her collar to the throat and mended her gloves twice so she'd look decent for a man in a grave, and he did the only honest thing left to him. "Yes," he said. "God forgive me. I wrote them." The word hung between them, and Marjorie Hale, who had not folded on the platform, who had not folded in the wagon, who had held herself upright through 4 days in a house of grief, felt the whole invented world she'd loved come down around her, at last, not the man dying, but the man never having been at all. "Every word," she whispered. "Every word." "The poem?" Her voice was a thread. "About the light coming over the ridge, and how it reminded him of a face you'd never seen, but somehow already—" She couldn't finish. "I wrote it at the kitchen table," Simon said, "at 2 in the morning with Wendell snoring in the next room. Yes. The scripture, about love being patient, about me. When you wrote that, you'd lie awake wondering what my voice sounded like." She was crying now, and didn't know it, tears running down and dropping off her jaw. "When you wrote that a woman's worth was never in the size of her, but the size of what she carried inside her. When you wrote—" She pressed her hand to her mouth. "That was you. All of it. Every kind word any man ever gave me in my whole life. It was you sitting at that table pretending to be your brother." "It wasn't pretending." Simon's voice broke on it. "Not the Marjorie, listen to me. It wasn't pretending, not the way you think. How dare you?" She said it soft, which was worse than a shout. How dare you say it wasn't pretending? You signed his name. 41 times you signed a name that wasn't yours to a woman who was falling in love with every line. What do you call that if not pretending? Simon Harper had no answer that would hold. He asked me to. It came out of him ragged. That's the truth of how it started, and I'll not dress it up prettier than it was. Wendell come to me a year back. He'd answered your advertisement, it was. Wendell answered it, his idea, his wanting a wife, and he'd got your first letter back, and he sat with it 2 whole days, not able to write a line. He couldn't do it, Marjorie. He wanted to, and he couldn't. And he was ashamed. My big, strong brother, who could break any horse in the territory sitting at that table with a pencil near crying because he couldn't spell the words to keep a woman who'd written him kind. Simon's own eyes were wet now. So he asked me. He said, Simon, you got the words, help me keep her. And I said I would. Because he was my brother, and he loved me, and I loved him, and what else does a man do? Marjorie stood there and let it come. So, the first ones I'd sit with him. He'd tell me what he wanted to say, and I'd put it into words that could hold it. That was all it was at the start. His heart, my hand. And I told myself that was clean enough. Simon dragged a sleeve across his face. But then your letters kept coming, and they weren't like anything I'd Marjorie do. You know what it is out here to open a letter from a mind like yours. You wrote about a book you'd read till it fell apart. You wrote about your mother's hands. You wrote once about standing at a window in a storm and feeling like the only awake soul in the whole world, and asking did I ever feel that, and He stopped. He made himself go on. Wendell had gone to bed. He didn't care much for that one. Said it was too full of feelings, said, just tell her the corn came in good. And I sat there at that table, and I read it 4 times, and I answered it myself. Not for him. For me. I answered your storm with mine, and I signed his name, because I'd already signed it 40 times, and there was no way back across that line. And that was the night I stopped writing his letters, and started writing mine. Did he know? Marjorie asked. Did Wendell know that his brother had gone and— No! Simon's voice was flat with self-hatred. He thought I was helping. He'd say, what did we tell her this week? And I'd read him something soft enough he'd nod and go to bed, happy his gal was still writing. He never knew the letters had stopped being his a long while back. He died thinking you loved him. Simon's jaw shook. And you did, didn't you? You loved him with your whole heart. Only the man you loved was never in that grave under the cottonwood. He's standing right here in front of you, and he's the sorriest coward that ever drew breath, and he'd rather you struck him than look at him the way you're looking at me now. For a long time, Marjorie said nothing at all. The dog got up off the porch and pressed its old head against her skirt, and she put her hand down on it, without knowing she did the way you hold on to whatever's near when the ground's gone. You let me get on a train, she finally said. Marjorie, you let me sell everything I owned. Her voice was rising now, and there was iron in it he hadn't heard before. You let me cross 2,000 miles. You wrote me come west, be my wife. We'll build it slow and honest, honest. You wrote that word. I can show you the letter. It's tied in blue ribbon in that room right now. You wrote honest to me while you were lying with every stroke of the pen. And then your brother dies, and I step off that train, and you stand there turning your hat in your hands, and you let me believe I was grieving Wendell. You let me grieve the wrong man to your face for 4 days rather than tell me the truth. I didn't know how. It was a wretched thing to say, and he knew it. You'd just lost him. How was I to walk up and say that man you're weeping for, he wasn't the one you loved, it was me, I'm the one, and by the way I let you find out he was dead by having his brother meet your train. There's no way to say it that isn't a knife. So I said nothing. I told myself I'd let you grieve first, get your feet under you, and then— But then that isn't cowardice, I know that. Amos said it before I could stop him, and now here we are, and every word out of my mouth is too late. Marjorie turned away from him. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood with her back to him, and her shoulders were shaking, and he did not dare to reach for her. Do you know what you took from me? She said without turning. It wasn't just him. I could survive a dead man. Women survive dead men every day out here. I've seen the graves. I know the arithmetic of this country. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. What you took is worse. You took the one thing I ever had that was mine. Those letters were the proof, the only proof in 34 years that a good man could see me and want me, that I wasn't what my whole life had told me I was. I held on to that through the worst nights, and now you've told me it was a lie wearing another man's name, and I've got nothing. I've got nothing, Simon Harper. You didn't just take Wendell. You took the woman I'd finally let myself believe I was. Simon Harper stood in the ruin of what he'd done and could not think of a single word worthy of it. Him who'd always had the words struck dumb at last when they mattered most. It wasn't a lie. He said it low. He said it like a man laying down his last card knowing it can't win. Everything I wrote you was the truest thing I ever did. That's the part I can't make right and can't take back. The name was a lie. The love wasn't. I know I've got no earthly right to say that word to you standing here over my brother's grave, wearing his guilt like my own skin. But you asked me straight the other morning, was the man in those letters real? And I looked you in the eye and told you he wanted you more than anything on earth. And Marjorie, that was the one true thing I've said since you got off that train. He's not dead. He's right here. And he's so sorry he can hardly stand. She turned around. Her face was wet and furious and grieving all at once, and she looked at him for a long, long moment. Looked at the man whose words she knew better than she'd ever known. Any face the man she had loved across 2,000 miles and buried in the wrong grave and hated now, with everything she had and could not. God help her stop knowing. Get away from me, Marjorie Hale said. Get away from me right now before I say something I can't unsay. You've had a year to be honest with me, and you weren't. You can give me till morning. And she walked past him, into the house. The dead man's house, the liar's house. The house that had been built room by room, for a woman who'd been courted by a ghost. And she shut the door of the little room behind her, and she sat down on the bed, with 41 letters tied in blue ribbon in her lap, and she did not know any more whether to hold them to her chest or throw them in the fire. She read them again. All night by a single candle, she read them again from the first to the last, and this time she read them knowing whose hand had made them, and that was the cruelest thing of all, because she could not find the lie in them. She looked for it. She wanted to find it, wanted to catch him out, wanted one cheap line, one false note, one word that rang like a con man's coin. And there wasn't one. The man who'd written these had meant every syllable. She could feel it the way she'd always felt it. The tenderness was real. The seeing was real. The night he'd written about the storm, and asked if she ever felt like the only waking soul that was a real man reaching for another real soul across the dark. And it did not matter one whit whose name was at the bottom. That was what she could not forgive. Not that it was false, that it was true and stolen and given to her under a lie and taken back the same way. She thought about her sister back east who had begged her not to go. Who had said, Marjorie, you don't know this man. You know a handful of letters, and a letter is only a man's best lie dressed up for Sunday. And Marjorie had answered with all the certainty of a woman who had finally been seen. No one lies this well for this long. About this much. No one keeps up a kindness for 11 whole months, if it isn't in him somewhere. She'd been right about that. That was the terrible joke of it. The kindness had been real. It had been in a man the whole time. It just hadn't been in the man whose name it wore. She turned the letters over in her lap, one by one, 41 of them. And she understood now that she'd never known Wendell Harper at all, that the man in the grave under the cottonwood was a stranger she'd been mourning by mistake. A good, hard-working, honest man who'd wanted a wife and died before he ever got one, and who deserved to be grieved for himself and not for words that were never his. She'd stolen his grief the same as Simon had stolen her love. Neither one of them had grieved the right man. Toward dawn she heard the chair scrape through the wall again. Heard him out there awake, same as her, the two of them separated by 3 inches of pine, and a ruin neither could climb out of. She got up once. She stood at the door with her hand on the latch. She could hear him breathing. She did not open it. Instead, she went back to the bed, and she took the first letter. the one where he'd written in a hand she now knew was Simon's and not Wendell's, that a woman who'd write a stranger about the books she loved was a woman worth crossing a lifetime for, and she pressed it flat against her chest, and she wept until the candle guttered out. In the gray before sunrise, Simon Harper knocked once soft on her door. "I made coffee," he said through the wood. "I'll leave it on the table. I won't stay in the room. You don't have to see me." A pause. "Amos is coming at 8 to help me move the north herd. I'll be gone the whole day. You'll have the house to yourself to think or to pack or whatever you decide. And Marjorie," his voice went rough, "if you decide to go, I'll take you to town myself, and I'll pay your fare all the way back east, whatever it costs, and I'll never trouble you again. That's yours to have. You don't owe me one thing. You never did." She heard his boots move away. She heard the front door open, and the old dog's tags, and the horses and Amos Teal's dry voice in the yard, and the two men riding out. And then the house was silent and empty, and hers for the first time since she'd come. Marjorie Hale sat up. She untied the blue ribbon from around the letters and let it fall across her knees. She looked at the door he'd knocked on. She looked at the coffee cooling on the table through the open doorway. The coffee a liar had made her a liar who'd offered to pay her fare home and ask nothing back. A liar whose every written word she believed even now down to the marrow. God help her. God help them both. She thought of the $4.60 in the purse at her wrist. She thought of her sister's voice men lie in letters, same as they lie in beds. And she thought she made herself think because she was a woman who had crossed a continent on the strength of what a heart could say to a heart, and she was not going to stop being that woman now, just because it had cost her everything she thought about the difference between a lie and a truth told wrong. She did not know yet what she would decide, but she got up. She washed her face. She pinned her hair. And she walked out to the kitchen and picked up the coffee he'd left her, and she wrapped both hands around the warmth of it, and she stood in the middle of that quiet house and waited for a man to come home so she could look him in the eye and tell him what she'd found in his letters in the dark. Because she had found something there she hadn't gone looking for. She'd found that she wasn't done. By noon the coffee had gone cold in her hands, and Marjorie had not moved. She had washed the breakfast dishes a liar hadn't eaten. She had swept a floor that didn't need it. Twice she'd walked to the little room, taken up her trunk by the handle, and set it down again. Her body could not decide what her heart already had. At mid-afternoon a horse came into the yard, and it wasn't Simon's. Marjorie went to the door and found a man swinging down off a tall bay broadcloth coat, town boots, a soft white hand that had never roped a thing in its life. He looked at the house and the barn and the corral the way a butcher looks at a hog. "Simon Harper about," he said. "He's out with the herd. Who's asking?" "Lyle Crandall." He tipped his hat with the smallest motion a hat could make. "And you'd be the correspondent's bride, I take it. The whole town's talking. My condolences on Wendell." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man reading a figure off a page. "I'll wait if it's all the same. My business won't keep." "What business?" Crandall smiled. "The kind a lady needn't trouble herself over. I've crossed 2,000 miles this month, Mr. Crandall. I've buried a fiancé I never met and learned a truth that'd flatten most people. I don't reckon there's much left that troubles me." She stayed in the doorway. "You can tell me your business, or you can tell it to that fence post. It'll listen about as long as I will to a man who won't." Something shifted in his face, surprise then a colder amusement. "You've got a tongue on you." "I've got a right one. What business?" He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, and he held it up but did not hand it over. The way a man dangles a thing to remind you it's his. "Wendell Harper borrowed against this ranch 14 months back," Crandall said. $600. Cattle money, timber money he was building on. Adding rooms. His eyes flicked past her to the house and back, and she understood exactly what he wanted her to understand. "For a wife, I hear. The note fell to me when the old lender sold out. It comes due the 1st of the month, 12 days from now. Principal and interest, or the ranch changes hands." Marjorie kept her face still. Inside, something had gone cold and fast the way water goes under ice. $600, she said. 640 with the interest run out. And Simon knows about this note. Simon's had 2 letters from me. Crandall folded the paper away again, satisfied. Simon's a man who don't answer letters he don't like, which is a shame, ma'am, because I'm not a hard man. There's arrangements could be made. A ranch this size, good water. He stopped himself, but not before she'd caught at the little catch of appetite in the word water. There's always arrangements. He'll want to think on them before the 1st. He'll answer you when he's ready to answer you. The 1st of the month don't wait on a man's readiness. Crandall gathered his reins. 12 days, Miss Hale. Tell him. And tell him it'd be a pity all that building, all that hope to lose it over pride. He touched his hat again. Welcome to Wheeler's Crossing. He rode out, and Marjorie stood watching the dust of him a long time. $640. She had $4.60. And somewhere 12 miles out, a man was moving cattle who'd lied to her with every letter she owned. And who was she now understood about to lose the only ground under his feet? She should have felt glad. She'd wanted in the dark of last night to burn his house down around his ears. Here was a stranger come to do it for her. She was not glad. That was the thing she'd have to answer for later when she was honest. She was not glad at all. Simon came in at dusk, gray with dust and worn to the bone, and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw her standing there. He'd been braced. She could see it for an empty house, for a trunk gone and a note left on the table. You're still here, he said. I'm still here. He took his hat off slow. Marjorie, a man came today, Lyle Crandall. She watched the name land on him like a fist. He's got a note on this place. $640 due the 1st. He says you've had 2 of his letters and answered neither. Simon shut his eyes. When he opened them, he looked 10 years older than the man who'd ridden out that morning. You weren't meant to hear about that, he said. No, I wasn't meant to hear about a lot of things. She set the cold cup down on the table with a click that was louder than she meant. That's been the whole trouble, hasn't it? Everything I wasn't meant to hear. Well, I'm through with not hearing Simon. You're going to sit down at that table, and you're going to tell me the truth about this ranch, all of it tonight, and I don't care how it makes you look. I've seen the worst of how you look. There's nothing left in you can surprise me now. She was wrong about that, but she couldn't have known it yet. He sat. She sat across from him, the width of the table between them, the same table where he'd written a stranger's name 41 times. $600, Simon said. Wendell borrowed it a year back against the deed, some for cattle, most for the lumber. His voice went thin. For the rooms. He wanted the house ready when you came. He wanted you to walk in and see he'd built you something. He said, Simon stopped and made himself say it. He said a woman who'd crossed the whole country deserved to walk into more than a bachelor's shack. So he borrowed on the future, on you. And then he died, and the cattle he bought with it are still half of them out on open range unbranded, and the note's coming due, and I've been out there every day trying to gather enough head to sell to cover it, and I'm short. I'm going to be short. How short? With everything I can round up and drive to the railhead before the first 200, maybe 250. He rubbed a hand down his face. It don't matter. Crandall don't want the money, Marjorie. I've dealt with his kind. He wants the land. He's been buying up paper on every spread with good water from here to the county line. There's talk of a rail spur coming through, and whoever holds the water holds the whole valley. He's not going to take my money even if I ride in there the 1st of the month and lay it on his desk in gold. He'll find the flaw in the coin. He'll say I'm a day late. Men like Crandall always find the flaw. Marjorie sat with that. Her practical mind, the mind no man back east had ever asked a single question of, was turning it over fast. Show me the note, she said. What? The paper. You've got a copy, he'd have left you one. Show me. And show me the deed, and whatever books Wendell kept, and every letter Crandall sent. She leaned forward. You said men like him find the flaw in the coin. Well, a coin's got 2 sides, Mr. Harper. Maybe there's a flaw in his. Simon looked at her across the table, and for a moment the exhaustion went out of his eyes, and something else came into them, something that was almost a laugh and almost grief. "You'd help me," he said. "After what I did, you'd sit up over Wendell's books and help me keep the ranch that liar built you. Don't mistake me." Her voice was flint. "I'm not helping you. I'm not ready to help you, and I don't know that I'll ever be. But Wendell Harper borrowed $600 building rooms for me, and he died before he could tell me himself. And I'll not sit by and let some soft-handed vulture take his grave and his land and his brother's roof over a debt that was near enough my own." She stood. "Get the papers. We'll start tonight." They spread it all across the table by lamplight. The note, the deed, a shoebox of receipts in Wendell's chicken-scratch hand, 4 letters from Crandall's lawyer, written in the cold, curling script of men who foreclose for a living. Marjorie read every line. She'd kept books for a dry goods man for 6 years back east, unpaid, because a woman couldn't hold the title of clerk, but could surely do the clerk's work while he took the wage. She knew where men hid things in a column of figures. It was past midnight when she found the first thing. This interest rate. She put her finger on the note. "Read me what Wendell agreed to." Simon leaned in. 8%. 8% per annum. That's what the note says. That's what Wendell signed. She slid Crandall's lawyer's letter across. "Now read me what they're charging." Simon read it twice. His jaw tightened. "That ain't 8%. That's 11, compounded, on a note that says 8 simple." Marjorie sat back. "Your Mr. Crandall bought this paper cheap, and he's been quietly padding the figure ever since betting a grieving rancher who won't open his mail, won't ever run the numbers. 640 he told me today. By the actual terms, Wendell signed." She tapped the box of receipts. "It's 580. He's trying to squeeze $60 out of you that the law never gave him. And a man who'll lie about 60 will lie about the whole thing." Simon finished very quiet. "We'll lie about the whole thing." She met his eyes across the lamp. "So no. We don't hand him money at his desk the first of the month and pray. We catch him in the flaw before the first in front of a witness, and we make him put in writing what he's really owed. And then we get it honest to the penny, and we shut the door on him." She stood and began gathering the papers. "You round up your cattle, Simon Harper. Every head you can find between here and the county line. I'll mind the arithmetic." He was staring at her. "Why?" "I told you why." "You told me a reason. You didn't tell me why." He didn't move from the table. "Last night you couldn't stand the sight of me. This morning I rode out sure I'd come home to an empty house, and I made my peace with it because it was no more than I'd earned. And now you're sitting up past midnight fighting a war that ain't yours for a man you can't forgive. And I need to know why, Marjorie, because if it's pity, I'd rather you left." Marjorie stood with the papers held against her chest, and for a long moment she didn't answer. "It isn't pity," she finally said. "Pity would be easy. Pity I could pack up and take Crandall's rail fare and go home and feel sorry for you from 2,000 miles off, same as I felt about the whole world from behind a shop counter my whole life." Her voice was steady, but something moved under it. "I stopped being that woman on a train platform 4 days ago. The woman who watches from a distance and lets things happen to her. She died the same week Wendell did." She turned for the little room. "I'm staying because I'm done watching. That's all the why you get tonight. Good night, Mr. Harper." She shut the door. But she stood behind it a moment, and through the pine, she heard him still sitting there. And she heard him say so low, she almost missed it. "Good night, Marjorie." In the voice of a man who'd been handed a thing he'd never expected to hold again. The next morning, the war began in earnest, and it did not go quiet. Simon rode out before light to gather cattle, and Marjorie set herself to the books and the house, and by the time the sun was 2 hours up, she'd already had her first visitor, and it wasn't a friendly one. The wagon that rolled into the yard held 3 women from town, stiff-backed, gloved with Mrs. Pruitt at the reins, like the prow of a ship. Marjorie went out to meet them, because a lifetime had taught her it was worse to be found hiding. "Miss Hale." Mrs. Pruitt did not get down. None of them got down. "We've come as a Christian courtesy, so you'll hear it from decent women before you hear it whispered." "Hear what, Mrs. Pruitt?" that your situation is a scandal." The other two women nodded like a pair of gate hinges. "An unmarried woman living alone out here with an unmarried man, no chaperone, no kin, no wedding, and Wendell hardly cold. It won't stand. Reverend Sykes has spoken of it from the pulpit, not by name, but everyone knew the name. Folk are saying things, Miss Hale, and once a woman's name is said a certain way in this town, it stays said." "Is that all?" Mrs. Pruitt blinked. "Is that, young woman, do you understand what I'm telling you? Your reputation, my reputation." Marjorie folded her hands in front of her the way she'd stood behind that counter for 6 years while men told her what she was worth. "Mrs. Pruitt, 4 days ago I stood on the depot platform in this town and learned the man I'd crossed a continent to marry was a week in his grave, and not one of you three came near me. Not one of you brought a covered dish or a kind word or so much as a hand on the shoulder. You stood at the back of that crowd and you counted my chins and you decided what I was." Her voice never rose, and that was what held them. "And now my reputation is your Christian concern. You'll forgive me if I don't reach for my smelling salts. I've kept a shop's books and buried a fiancé, and I'll keep a dead man's ranch out of a swindler's hands before the month is out, and I'll do it with my name," said, however. "This town cares to say it. You can drive on, ladies. There's nothing here for you to save." The three women sat in a silence you could have poured over pancakes. Then Mrs. Pruitt drew herself up. "Well, I see the East breeds a very bold sort of woman." "It breeds a very tired sort," Marjorie said. "Good morning." They drove out, and Marjorie stood in the yard with her heart going hard against her ribs, half sick and half something she hadn't felt in years, something that was almost like being alive. She'd never in her life talked to anyone the way she'd just talked to Mrs. Pruitt. She'd never dared. The woman she used to be would have stood there and taken it and cried about it later into a pillow. That woman really was gone. It surprised her how little she missed her. She did not know that Amos Teal had ridden up behind the barn and heard the last half of it and was standing there grinning around his ruined ear like a man who'd watched a good horse race. "Lordy," he said when the wagon was gone, "you put the whole church choir to flight with a folded pair of hands." Wendell'd have loved that. Wendell couldn't never think what to say till 3 days after. He chuckled, then his face clouded the way an old man's does when memory runs ahead of him. Now Simon'd have had the words for them women right off. Them two boys. He shook his head. Chalk and cheese. Fought like cats their whole lives on account of it. Marjorie went still. "Fought," she said, careful, easy, the way you approach a skittish thing. "Brothers do. Not like them two. Not at the end." Amos was looking off toward the cottonwood now, not really seeing her, sunk into the slow river of an old man's remembering. That last day. Whooey! I never heard the like. Standing right out there by the corral, hollering fit to spook the horses. Wendell threw his own hat in the dirt, I seen it. And Simon just standing there white as a bedsheet taking it. I asked Wendell after what in creation that was about, and he wouldn't say. Rode off hot. Rode off toward the North Wash with his blood up, wouldn't hardly look where he was going. The old man's voice trailed. Wasn't but an hour later we was pulling him out of it. The morning went very quiet around Marjorie Hale. "Amos." Her own voice came from far away. "What day was that? The day they fought. Why the day he died, ma'am?" Amos blinked, surprised she'd ask. "Same day. Last thing them two brothers ever did on this earth was scream at each other by that corral, and Wendell rode off mad and never come back." He shook his head mournful. "Simon's carried it hard. Harder in the burying, I think. A man can bury a brother. It's the not making it right that eats him." He gathered his reins. "Well, I'll go see can I help him gather. You did good with them hens, Miss Hale. Real good." He rode off toward the range, leaving Marjorie standing alone in the yard, with the whole floor gone out from under her a second time in 4 days. They had fought. The day Wendell died, the brothers had fought screaming in front of the corral, and Wendell had thrown his hat in the dirt and ridden off blind with rage into the wash, where an hour later he died. And Simon had stood there white as a sheet taking it. She did not need Amos to tell her what the fight had been about. She had known it the instant the old man said white as a sheet. She had seen that same white come over Simon in the wagon at the stove at the kitchen table when she'd laid her hand on his. Wendell had found out. That was the truth she'd been too battered to reach for. Wendell had found out that his own brother had written the letters, had written himself into the woman coming west to marry him. And the brothers had fought about it, and Wendell had ridden off in a fury and gotten himself killed. Which meant the man who'd been sitting across a lamp from her all night, the man she'd agreed to help save this ranch, was carrying more than a lie. He was carrying his brother's grave. Marjorie sat down on the porch step because her legs would not hold her, and she stayed there a long time while the day burned on, turning it, and every way she turned it, it cut. Simon came in at dark alone. Amos had gone home, driving a small bunch of gaunt cattle into the corral. He worked the gate and stripped his gloves and turned toward the house, and when he saw her sitting on the step in the last of the light, he slowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "I've been talking to Amos." He went still the way he always went still, and this time she watched it happen and understood it for what it was. "You fought with Wendell," Marjorie said. "The day he died, by the corral. He threw his hat in the dirt and rode off into the wash with his blood up, and you stood there white as a sheet. And an hour later, he was dead." She kept her eyes on his face and would not let him look away. "He found out about the letters, didn't he? That's what the fight was. Your brother found out what you'd done." Simon Harper did not deny it. He came up the 2 steps slow and he sat down on the porch beside her. Not close his forearms on his knees, and he looked out at nothing. "He found a letter I hadn't sent yet," Simon said. His voice had no fight left in it at all. "In my coat. He wasn't snooping, it fell out when he grabbed my coat for the cold. He couldn't read it. I told you he couldn't hardly read, but he knew his own name at the bottom in my hand, and he knew the shape of a love letter when he held one, and he made me read it to him." Simon's jaw worked. "So I read it to him. Every word. The letter I was going to send my brother's bride in my brother's name that I'd written from my own heart at 2 in the morning. I read it to his face. And he understood. He understood everything." Simon's voice cracked down the middle. He said that ain't help, Simon. Help was the corn came in good. This here." Simon stopped, started again. "He said you took her. You been taking her out from under me a letter at a time and letting me think she was mine. And he was right. God help me, he was right. And I couldn't say one word back because there wasn't one that wasn't a bigger lie than the last. So he threw his hat down and he called me every name a brother's got. And he got on his horse, and the last thing my brother ever said to me on this earth was that he never wanted to see my face again." Simon pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "And I gave it to him. I never saw his face again. An hour later, we hauled him out of the wash with his neck broke, and I've thought every single day since that if I'd never picked up that pen, my brother would be alive, and you'd have married a good man. And the only thing missing from either of your lives would have been a little poetry neither of you ever needed to begin with." For a long while, neither of them said anything. The gaunt cattle shifted in the corral. The old dog came and lay down between them on the step with a groan, as if the weight of the 2 of them was more than the wood could hold up alone. "That's why you couldn't tell me," Marjorie finally said. "On the platform, in the wagon. Why you let me grieve the wrong man 4 days. It wasn't only that I'd be hurt. It was that the truth doesn't stop at you lied. The truth is, your brother's dead because of it, and to tell me the one you'd have to tell me the other, and you couldn't put that on a grieving woman, and you couldn't carry it out loud yourself." She was not excusing him. She wanted that understood even to herself, but she saw it now whole, and a thing seen whole cannot be unseen. "You've been drowning quiet for a week. I don't want your understanding, Marjorie." His voice was raw. "I don't deserve one drop of it. You come out here for a wedding and I've handed you a dead fiancé, a lie, and now a dead man I as good as killed. If you got any sense, you'll take Crandall's rail fare and go home and forget every Harper that ever drew breath." "I've been told what I ought to do by a lot of people," Marjorie said, "and none of them ever once turned out to know better than I did." She stood up off the step. Wendell threw a hat in the dirt and rode off angry. That was Wendell's doing. A grown man chose to ride blind into a wash because his pride was stung, and that is a tragedy, and it is a sorrow, and it is not a murder. Simon Harper, no matter how bad you want to hang it round your own neck. You wrote a lie. You did not break your brother's neck. Those are two different sins, and you don't get to pay for the one you didn't commit just because it hurts worse to be innocent of it. Simon looked up at her like a man who'd been struck. You come out to gather more head at first light, she said. There's $580 coming due, and a swindler counting on us being too broke and too broken to fight him. I don't intend to give him the satisfaction. Do you? A long breath went out of Simon Harper. Something in his shoulders that had been braced against the world for a week eased just slightly, just enough. No, he said. No, ma'am. I don't. Then eat something and sleep. You're no use to me dead on your feet. She went to the door and stopped with her hand on it and did not turn around. And Simon, what you read to me last night, the poem, the storm, all of it. I sat up over those letters again this morning, looking for the seam where the lie got in, where you stopped meaning it and started performing it. Her voice was very quiet. I couldn't find the seam. That's the whole trouble with you. There isn't one. Good night. She went in. And Simon Harper sat on the step in the dark a long time with his dead brother's dog and did not trust himself to believe the thing that had just been said to him, because a man who has stopped hoping does not know how to start again all at once. The days that followed ran fast and hard. They fell into a rhythm neither of them named. Simon rode out before light and came in after dark, driving in ones and twos and small gaunt bunches of Harper cattle off the open range, branding what wasn't branded, tallying head against the number they needed. Marjorie kept the books and the house and rode the arithmetic like a second horse, recalculating the true note against Crandall's padded figure, drafting in her clean shop clerk's hand the letter that would trap him riding once herself in the wagon to the county seat 2 towns over to pull the original loan record from the courthouse before Crandall thought to have it misplaced. She came back from that ride with the record in her lap and her mouth set in a line because she'd found the second thing. Simon. She had it out on the table before he'd got his coat off. The note Crandall showed me, and the note on file at the county. They're not the same paper. He came over slow. What do you mean, not the same? I mean, the amount's been altered on his copy. Wendell borrowed $600, that's what's recorded, that's what he signed. Crandall's showing a note for $650. Somebody's put a tail on that knot to make it a 5. She looked up at him grim and bright at once. He didn't just pad the interest. He forged the principal. That's not sharp dealing anymore, Simon. That's a crime. That's the kind of thing a man goes to prison for if the right people see the 2 papers side by side. Simon sat down heavily. You rode 2 towns over and pulled a courthouse record. I kept a dry goods man out of 3 lawsuits he never knew about because I read what he signed before he signed it. Yes, I rode 2 towns over. She squared the papers. Now listen, because this is delicate. If we go to him waving forgery, he'll burn his copy of the note and swear he never had one, and it's my word against a landowner's, and you know whose word this valley takes. We need him to commit to his lie in front of a witness who'll hold. Somebody in this town whose name means something. Somebody even Crandall can't buy or frighten. There ain't such a man in Wheeler's Crossing, Simon said. Crandall's bought half of it and scared the other half. Marjorie was quiet a moment. Then slowly, a thought came up in her that she did not much like, but that she could not put down. There's the Reverend Sykes, she said. Simon's head came up. The preacher who as good as read you out of the congregation from the pulpit? The man that's got this whole town believing you're a scarlet woman living in sin. That man, Marjorie said. A man of God who thinks I'm a fallen woman and thinks Crandall's a pillar of the community. If we can get the Reverend Sykes to stand in a room and watch Lyle Crandall lie about a forged note with his own eyes, there's no man in this valley Crandall could better use for a witness, and no man harder for him to explain away after. She met Simon's eyes. It means walking into that church. It means asking a favor of the one man who's done me the most public harm. It means eating every ounce of it with a smile. You can't ask that of yourself. I've asked worse of myself this week. She began putting the papers away. I crossed a continent for a dead man, and I stayed in his liar brother's house, and I've faced down the whole church choir in my own yard. I reckon I can put on my good collar and ask a proud fool of a preacher to do the one right thing his religion's actually for. She looked up. Question is whether you'll stand next to me while I do it. Because I'll not walk into that church alone, Simon. That much charity I'll not extend the town of Wheeler's Crossing. Simon Harper stood up. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the train for the first time, she'd seen something came into his face that wasn't guilt or grief or fear. It was closer to what she imagined a man looked like the moment he decided to stop losing. I'll stand next to you, he said, if you'll have me next to you. Anywhere in this valley, any hour you name. He held her eyes. Marjorie, I know I've got no right, but I'd stand next to you at the gates of hell and count it the finest thing I ever did. The words hung there, and Marjorie Hale, who knew this man's written words better than she knew her own name, heard for the first time the spoken ones come out of him, plain and unsigned, no brother's name at the bottom, nothing between the words and her but the air of a dead man's kitchen, and she felt the thing she'd been fighting since the porch step, the thing she had no business feeling and could not stop move once hard under her ribs. She turned away before he could see it in her face. Sunday, then, she said to the papers, to the wall, to anything but him. We go to church Sunday, and we look the Reverend Sykes in the eye, and we set the trap for Crandall, 6 days to the first. It's enough. It has to be enough. It'll be enough, Simon said. But that night, as she lay in the little room with 41 letters, no longer tied in blue ribbon, but loose now, read and reread, softened at every fold, Marjorie heard the wind come up outside, and then she heard something else. Hooves more than one horse coming fast into the yard in the dark. At an hour, no honest man rides. She heard Simon's boots hit the floor in the next room. She heard the front door, and Simon's voice go hard, and then a second voice she'd heard only once, but would not soon forget, soft and smiling, even in the dark. Lyle Crandall's voice in the Harper yard at midnight 6 days early, and under it low, the sound of men dismounting. More than one, more than two. Marjorie sat up in the dark with her heart slamming and her bare feet already reaching for the floor, and she understood cold and clear that Crandall had not come to wait for the first of the month after all. He'd come to make sure the first of the month never mattered. She was into her dress and out the door before her mind caught up to her feet. Simon stood on the porch with the lamp turned up, coatless, and below him in the yard sat Lyle Crandall on the tall bay, easy in the saddle, and behind him 2 men she didn't know. Big men, hard men, the kind a town keeps in the back of a saloon for the days a debt needs collecting with more than paper. Get back inside, Marjorie, Simon said without turning. I will not. Crandall lifted his hat to her unhurried as if it were noon and he'd come to call. Miss Hale, I did hope you'd be sleeping. This is a man's conversation. Then you've come to the wrong ranch, Marjorie said, because there's more sense on this porch than there is in that saddle, and most of it's in a skirt. What do you want at midnight, Mr. Crandall, that couldn't wait for the sun like a Christian's business? Crandall smiled, but it had gone thin at the edges. I heard a curious thing today. I heard a woman drove a Harper wagon clear to the county seat and spent the afternoon in the recorder's office pawing through old loan papers. His voice stayed soft. That was the frightening part of him Marjorie was learning. The softer he got, the worse he meant. Now why, I asked myself, would a grieving bride ride 2 towns over to read a dead man's mortgage? What's she hoping to find? Bad arithmetic, Marjorie said. I found some. The yard went very still. You want to be careful, ma'am, Crandall said. Throwing a word like that around a valley where I'm owed a good deal of money by a good many people. Words get repeated. Reputations are delicate things. Yours especially. He let that sit. I'd hate to see a woman already the subject of so much unkind talk add liar to the list, or the Harper name add cheat to killer. Simon came down a step. You watch your mouth. Do I say something untrue? Crandall spread his soft white hands. The whole town knows the brothers had words the day Wendell died. The whole town knows he rode off in a black rage and broke his neck an hour later. And now the surviving brothers got the dead one's bride living under his roof, and the dead one's ranch under his boots, and folks do wonder, Harper. Folks do wonder what those words were about, and whether a man so convenient in his grieving oughtn't be looked at a little closer. His eyes slid to Marjorie. Wouldn't take much. A word here, a question there. I've found this valley very willing to believe the worst of people once you give it a place to start. Marjorie felt Simon go rigid beside her, felt the terrible thing in him reach up, the guilt, the grave, the fear, and she knew Crandall had found it too, had smelled it the way his kind smells blood, and meant to twist it until Simon broke or ran or signed away the ranch just to make the words stop. So she stepped down off the porch, past Simon, out into the yard toward the horses, close enough that the hired men shifted close enough that Crandall's easy smile faltered at the sight of a woman walking toward trouble instead of away from it. You listen to me, Lyle Crandall. Her voice did not shake, and she made herself thank God for the 6 years behind a counter that had taught it not to. You've come to a house of grief in the dark of night with 2 paid brutes to frighten a tired man into signing away his land. And you thought you'd sweeten it by dragging a dead man out of his grave to do it. You thought the woman would faint and the man would fold. She stopped an arm's length from the bay. I've buried my whole life this month, Mr. Crandall. There is not one thing you can say in this yard that's worse than what I've already lived. So say your worst to the whole valley. Say the Harpers are killers, and I'm a scarlet woman, and the moon's made of green cheese. And while you're saying it, I'll be doing sums. Because I know exactly what Wendell Harper signed, and I know exactly what you're claiming he signed, and the two are not the same paper. And when the day comes that those 2 papers sit side by side on a table in front of an honest man, she saw it land, saw the smile go out of him entirely. It won't be the Harper name that adds a new word to it. Now get off this land. You're trespassing, there's a witness on that porch, and I'd hate to see forgery add trespass to your list. For a moment, nobody moved. One of the hired men looked to Crandall for a word to get down to make her afraid to do the thing they'd been paid to do. And Crandall, for the first time, did not have the word ready. He looked at this plain, tired, unafraid woman standing an arm's length from his horse, and something recalculated behind his eyes, and Marjorie understood she'd just made an enemy who would not underestimate her twice. 2 papers, Crandall said slowly. That's an interesting thing to know, Miss Hale. I wonder who told you they weren't the same. Nobody told me. I read them. That's the whole trouble with people like you. She held his gaze. You bet your entire life that nobody reads. Crandall gathered his reins. When he spoke again, the softness was gone, and what was under it was uglier and more honest. The 1st of the month, he said. 5 days. Every dollar owed in coin on my desk, or the deed's mine, and the sheriff walks the both of you off this land in front of the whole town. And if you're half as clever as you think you are, ma'am, you'll spend those days convincing Harper to sell to me quiet and take what I offer, because I promise you, clever or not forged, or not a woman with no name, and a man with a dead brother, do not beat Lyle Crandall in Wheeler's Crossing. He wheeled the bay. Enjoy your sums. They rode out hard into the dark, 3 sets of hooves, and the sound of them faded off toward town. And then there was nothing but the wind and the gaunt cattle shifting in the corral, and the old dog growling low at the gate long after there was anything left to growl at. Marjorie's legs went at last. Not all the way. She caught the corral rail and stood there with her head down, and her whole body shaking, now that there was no one left to see it shake. And then there was a hand at her elbow steady, and Simon's voice low at her shoulder. I've got you, he said. I've got you. Come sit before you fall. He got her to the porch step and sat her down and crouched in front of her. And he didn't touch her beyond the elbow, kept his hands to himself, the way a man does when he knows he hasn't earned the right, but he stayed close enough that she could hold on to the fact of him. You walked up to his horse, Simon said. His voice was unsteady. You walked right up to a man who brought 2 hired fists to this yard, and you dared him. Marjorie, if he'd said one word to them, they could have... He wasn't going to. She was still shaking, but her mind was already climbing back out. Men like Crandall don't dirty their own hands unless they're sure it's safe, and a woman standing in the open talking about courthouse papers is the least safe thing in the world to touch. If he'd let those men lay a hand on me, he'd have handed us the one thing we don't have, a crime with a witness. She looked up at him. I wasn't brave, Simon. I did arithmetic. There's a difference. No, Simon said quietly. There isn't. Not the way you do it. They sat with that. The wind moved. The dog came and put its head in Marjorie's lap, and she rested her hand on it and felt her heart slow at last toward something like even. He knows about the letters, she said. Or near enough. He knows Wendell couldn't write. He knows the brothers fought. He's going to use it, not the truth. He doesn't care about the truth. He's going to use the shape of it. He'll make this valley believe you killed your brother over a woman. She turned her head and looked at him in the lamplight. And the awful thing is, the shape's close enough to hurt. Because you do blame yourself. He can smell it. He'll press right on the bruise. Simon didn't look away from her, though she could see what it cost him. Then let him. If standing up in front of the whole town and eating that lie is what keeps his hands off you, I'll stand there and eat it every Sunday from now to judgment. That's the wrong answer, Marjorie said. The right answer is we don't give him the days to build it. 5 days. We set the trap Sunday in front of Reverend Sykes, and we spring it before Crandall's whisper has time to grow legs. We don't defend against the lie. We end the man telling it. She drew a breath, and it came steadier than the last. You still with me? Simon Harper looked at her a long moment. This woman who'd walked up to a killer's horse and called it arithmetic, who 3 nights ago couldn't stand the sight of him, and now sat on his porch in the dark, planning his salvation with a dog in her lap, and her hand not 2 feet from his, and not pulled away, and whatever was in his face. Then he didn't try to hide, and for once she didn't turn from it. I'm with you, he said. God knows I don't deserve to be. But I'm with you, Marjorie Hale, till the last dollar's paid, and that man's run out of this valley. And after that, too, if you'd ever let me, which I know you won't, which I've got no right to ask. He stood slow and offered his hand to help her up off the step. The same split-knuckled hand that had buried her fiancé, that had written her every kind word she owned, and this time when she looked at it, she didn't think about the grave. She took it. She let him pull her to her feet. And for the length of one breath, they stood there in the dark of the porch closer than they'd ever stood, her hand still in his, neither of them moving, the whole ruined, impossible thing between them gone quiet and waiting. Then she let go. 5 days, she said, and her voice was almost her own again. Get some sleep, Simon. We've got a swindler to ruin and a preacher to charm, and I can't do either one if you're falling off your horse. She went to the door. Good night. Good night, he said. And then, as she lifted the latch quiet, like a man who couldn't stop the words, and had given up trying, thank you, for staying, for all of it. I'll spend the rest of my life not deserving it. Marjorie Hale stood with her hand on the latch and her back to him, and she did not say it wasn't so, and she did not say she forgave him because she didn't yet, and she was through with saying things she didn't mean. But she said before she went in a voice she barely let herself hear, You keep signing your name at the bottom of things, Simon. Only now you're doing it out loud. And she shut the door soft behind her, and left him standing in the lamplight to make of that whatever a man makes of the first thing in a long week that felt like being forgiven and wasn't not yet, but might one day be. 5 days to the first of the month. And in the little room, by no candle at all, this time, Marjorie Hale lay awake in the dark, with her heart going hard, and her mind going harder. And she did not reach for the letters, because for the first time since the platform, she didn't need to. The man who'd written them was 3 inches away through a pine wall awake, same as her. And she knew now to the marrow what she'd only feared before, that whatever she decided about Simon Harper, about the lie and the grave, and the whole broken beginning of it, she was not going to decide it from a train headed east. She was going to decide it here, on this ground. With 5 days a forged note and a valley full of people who'd already made up their minds about her. And, Lord help Lyle Crandall, she thought, just before sleep took her. At last. If he'd built his whole scheme on the one bet her entire life had taught her how to beat. That nobody reads. The 5 days went by like water through a fist. Simon rode from dark to dark and drove in every head the range would give him. And Marjorie kept the tally. And by the Saturday night before the first, they both knew the hard truth of it. He'd gathered enough cattle to raise $350 at the railhead, and the honest debt was $580. And between the two figures lay a gap no amount of wishing closed. "We're 230 short," Simon said at the table, his voice flat with a whole week's exhaustion. "Even beating him on the forgery, even if we prove every dishonest thing that man's done, we still owe $580 honest, and we've got $350, and the first is Monday. Marjorie, the sums don't come out. I've done them 40 ways. They come out," Marjorie said, "if we stop trying to win with money." She had the county record squared in front of her and the letter she'd drafted folded beside it. "We can't outpay Crandall, so we don't. We out-truth him. A man who's forged a note doesn't foreclose on you, Simon. He doesn't dare once you can prove it, because the second the sheriff sees those two papers side by side, it's Crandall walking off to a cell, not us walking off this land. He knows that. I need him to know that we know it in a room he can't lie his way out of in front of a man he can't buy. Then he doesn't take the ranch. He takes what's honestly owed on honest terms with time to pay it, and he leaves this valley grateful we didn't hang him for it. And if he won't, then he goes to prison, and the note goes with him, and we sort out the rest after." She looked up. "But he'll take the deal. Men like Crandall love their own skin more than any acre. Tomorrow we find out." "Tomorrow's Sunday." "Tomorrow's Sunday," Marjorie agreed. "And every soul in Wheeler's Crossing will be sitting in one building at one time, including the Reverend Sykes, and if I've baited it right, Lyle Crandall himself. There won't be a better room in this county to spring it." She stood and gathered her papers. "Wear your good shirt, Simon. We're going to church." That night, long after she'd meant to sleep, Marjorie heard the chair scrape through the wall, and then a soft knock, and Simon's voice low through the pine. "You awake?" "I'm awake. I keep thinking," he said, and stopped, and she heard him lean his forehead against the door, the small thud of it. "If tomorrow goes wrong, if he turns them on us and it sticks. I don't want you standing in the middle of it, Marjorie. This is my mess, my brother, my lie, my note. You could still take the morning train and be clear of the whole thing before Crandall opens his mouth." Marjorie lay looking at the dark ceiling. "Is that what you want?" "No." The word came out of him ragged. "God forgive me, no. I want you in that pew beside me more than I've wanted anything since—" He stopped himself. "But wanting a thing and being owed it ain't the same, and I've learned that the hard way, and I'll not be a coward about it twice. So I'm telling you the door's open. You want the train, I'll drive you to it myself at first light, and not say one word against it." Marjorie was quiet a long moment. "Go to bed, Simon," she finally said, and her voice through the door was not unkind. "I didn't cross a continent to run from a swindler in a broadcloth coat. I'll be in the pew." A pause. "Left side, save me the aisle." She heard him laugh once, surprised and wet, like a man who hadn't laughed in a month. "Left side," he said. "Aisle's yours." And she heard his forehead leave the door, and his steps go, and she lay there in the dark, smiling at nothing, which frightened her worse than any of it, because a woman does not smile in the dark at a man she has only agreed to help. They walked in together the next morning, and the whole congregation turned to look. It was the kind of quiet a room makes when every person in it has been talking about you and stops all at once. Marjorie felt it land on her the way it always had, that old weight, the counting eyes. And then she felt Simon's hand come to rest light and steady at the small of her back. And she did not step away from it, and together they walked up the aisle to a pew near the front, while the town watched the Scarlet Woman and the maybe murderer take their seats bold as brass in the house of God. Mrs. Pruitt's whisper carried as it was meant to. "The nerve." Marjorie turned her head and looked at the woman full in the face, and smiled sweet as pie, and Mrs. Pruitt shut her mouth. The Reverend Sykes preached that morning on a text about the woman taken in adultery, and he preached it at Marjorie, and everyone knew he preached it at her, and Marjorie sat through every word of it with her chin up and her hands folded, and did not give him the flinch he was fishing for. When he got to the part about, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," she let herself think quietly that the Reverend Sykes had clearly never once considered which end of that verse he was standing on. After the service, she did not slip out the side. She walked straight up to the front. Simon a half step behind her, and she waited while the last of the congregation filed past, staring. And when the church had nearly emptied, she said, "Reverend Sykes, I'd have a word." The preacher was a lean, dry man with a face like a closed ledger. "Miss Hale, I don't know that there's anything you and I have to—" "Lyle Crandall is going to walk through that door in about an hour," Marjorie said, "expecting to collect on a debt. And when he does, Reverend, I am going to prove to you with a paper pulled from the county recorder's own file that he has forged that debt and padded it and lied about it to a grieving family. And I would like you to be standing here to see it, because you are the one man in this valley whose word Lyle Crandall cannot buy and cannot frighten, and I have run out of any other kind." Sykes's dry face did not move. "That's a serious charge against a respected man." "It is. That's why I'm not asking you to take my word. I'm asking you to watch him with your own eyes and use the judgment God gave you." She held his gaze. "You preached a sermon at me this morning, Reverend, about stones and sinners. I'll not pretend it didn't sting, but I'll wager you meant it as scripture and not just as a knife. And if you meant it, then here's your chance to find out whether the sinner in this town is the woman you preached at or the man you've been shaking hands with on the church steps. 1 hour. That's all I ask. Stand here and watch." "And why should I believe you'd know a forged note from an honest one?" Sykes said. "You've been in this valley a fortnight. You've kept house for an unmarried man. You've given this whole congregation cause to talk." "To talk. Yes, I know exactly what I've given them." Marjorie didn't drop her eyes. "I kept a merchant's books for 6 years, Reverend, and read every contract that crossed his counter because a woman could do the work as long as a man could take the credit for it. I know a forged note the way you'd know a false witness by the smell of it. And you don't have to believe one word I say. That's the whole beauty of what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stand in a room and watch a man who thinks he's untouchable and use the 2 eyes God gave you. If I'm wrong, you've lost an hour. If I'm right, you'll save half this valley from a thief you've been calling a pillar. Now, which of those is worth more to a man of God on a Sunday afternoon?" For a long moment, the Reverend Sykes looked at her, and something behind the ledger of his face turned a page. "I'll watch," he said. "And Miss Hale, if you're lying to me, if this is some scheme to drag a good man down, God will not be mocked, and neither will I." "I'm counting on it," Marjorie said. "Both counts." Crandall came within the hour, and he did not come alone. He'd brought his 2 hired men, and he'd brought half the town with him, or the town had come on its own to see the Harpers put out. Marjorie couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter. Mrs. Pruitt was there, the mercantile clerk, a dozen others drifting back in through the church doors, because word had gone round that something was fixing to happen, and a valley starved for its own entertainment does not miss a hanging. "Miss Hale." Crandall's soft smile was back in place, warmed now by the audience. "You sent word you wished to settle. I confess I'm surprised. I took you for the stubborn sort." He drew the folded note from his coat and held it up for the room to see. "But sense is sense. The Harpers owe $640 against this ranch due tomorrow. If they've got it, I'll mark it paid, and we'll part friends. If they haven't, well." He spread his hands to the crowd. "A debt's a debt, even for a widow who was never quite a wife." A ripple of laughter. Simon's hand closed into a fist at his side, and Marjorie set 2 fingers against his wrist light without looking, and he held. 640, Marjorie said. "You're certain of the figure, Mr. Crandall, in front of the Reverend, in front of all these good people. $640 on a note Wendell Harper signed. To the penny. You'd swear it." "I'd swear it on that Bible," Crandall said, nodding to the pulpit playing to the house, "if the Reverend cared to bring it over." "That won't be necessary." Marjorie unfolded the paper she'd carried from the county seat and laid it on the front pew where the light fell on it. And she said, in the clear carrying voice she'd learned across a counter over 6 silent years, "Reverend Sykes, would you read that aloud? That's the loan Wendell Harper signed, copied out under the county recorder's own seal not 4 days ago. Would you read the room the principal?" The Reverend Sykes took up the paper. He read it, and his dry face changed. $600, Sykes said slowly. "Read it again, Reverend." $600, at 8%. Sykes looked up, and his eyes went to Crandall, and there was a new and terrible attention in them. "This says 600, Mr. Crandall, at 8. You just swore 640. A clerical?" Crandall's smile flickered. "The interest, of course, the accrued. At 8% simple on $600 for 14 months. Marjorie said, the interest is $56, Mr. Crandall, not 1 penny more. I've done that sum 40 ways, and it comes out 56 every time. 656 is 656, no. Wait." She let the pause sit, and she watched him understand where she was walking him, and she watched him be unable to stop her. "That's not your figure either, is it? Your figure was 640, which is less. Now why on earth would a lender undercharge himself?" She turned to the crowd. "He wouldn't. So the 640 was never honest interest at all. It was a padded principal dressed up to look like a fair sum low enough not to spook a grieving man high enough to steal from him. Show them your note, Mr. Crandall. Hold it up. Show the Reverend the principal you wrote on it, and let him lay it beside the county's." Crandall did not hold up his note. "Hold it up," Sykes said, and it was not a request now. "This is a private matter of business," Crandall started, "and I'll not have a church full of—" "You brought the church full, Lyle." The Reverend Sykes stepped down off the chancel, and the ledger of his face had opened all the way now, and what was written in it was fury. "You marched them in here to watch a widow lose her home. Well, they're watching. Hold up the note." Crandall's soft white hand tightened on the paper, and for one moment Marjorie saw him weigh, burning it, eating it, running. And then he saw the 2 hired men look at him differently, saw the crowd's mood turn under him like a tide going out. And he understood that in a room this size, a man cannot make a paper disappear. Reverend Sykes took the note from his hand. He laid it beside the county record on the pew. He looked from one to the other, and the whole church leaned in to watch a preacher read 2 numbers. "The county says 600, Sykes said very quiet into a silence gone total. "This one says 650. And the knot?" His finger touched Crandall's paper. "The knot's got a tail on it, in fresher ink. A tail that makes a knot a 5. He raised his head, and he looked at Lyle Crandall the way a man looks at something he's just found under a rock. "You altered a signed note. You forged Wendell Harper's debt. And you swore to the false figure not 2 minutes ago on your feet in the house of the Lord in front of 40 witnesses." The church made a sound, then, not a shout, a kind of collective indrawn breath, the sound a crowd makes when it changes its mind all at once about who the villain is. "That's a lie," Crandall said, but his voice had cracked, and everyone heard the crack. "That's a lie. She's turned you all." "She could have altered that county paper herself," he went on, snatching at it, wheeling to the crowd. "How do any of you know she didn't sit in that recorder's office and copy it out to suit her own ends? A clever woman, a pen, an afternoon alone with the records. Because I didn't copy it. The county recorder did." Marjorie let the words fall flat and hard. "In his own hand under his own seal, which you're welcome to ride 2 towns over and match against 100 other records in his book. Or the Reverend is. Or the sheriff is. Or any man here who still can't make up his mind whom to believe. That seal is the one signature in this whole affair that you never got your hands on, Mr. Crandall. That's the very reason it's the only one that tells the truth." She tapped it. "You can forge a rancher who couldn't read. You cannot forge a county. You should have picked a smaller enemy than the state the day you decided nobody reads." "I'm not the one turned them," Marjorie said. "You did that yourself the second you got greedy with a knot." She stepped closer to him, and her voice dropped low and level, and only for the room. Here's how it goes now, Mr. Crandall. The Harpers owe you $600, honest less the 56 interest you never earned because you voided your own terms with fraud. But I'm a fair woman, so we'll call it the 6 even, and we'll pay you what we can raise at the railhead, and you'll grant honest time on the rest, and you'll sign a paper before the Reverend saying the debt is 600, and the terms are 8%, and there is no forgery in it. And in exchange that county record, and this altered note, and 40 witnesses do not walk down the road to the sheriff's office. She let it land. That's the deal. It's better than you deserve, and it's the only one you're getting. Prison or a signature? Choose. Lyle Crandall stood in the middle of the church he'd meant to be his theater and looked at the ring of faces that had come to watch the Harpers fall and stayed to watch him do it instead, and Marjorie saw the fight go out of him inch by inch. He'd built his whole life on people not reading. He'd finally met the one who did. "I'll sign," he said barely, and it might have ended there. Clean won the ranch saved and the swindler shamed, except that a cornered man is at his most dangerous in the last second, before he goes down, and Lyle Crandall had one card left, and he was not the sort to lose a hand without playing it. "I'll sign your paper," he said louder now, turning to the crowd, throwing it out into them like a man throwing coal on a fire he means to burn the whole house with. "I'll sign it. But before you all go feeling sorry for these two, ask yourselves what you're feeling sorry for. Ask this woman why she's really out at that ranch. Ask her about the letters." His eyes glittered. "Go on." "Ask her why she crossed 2,000 miles to marry Wendell Harper when Wendell Harper couldn't read nor write a lick. Ask her whose hand really wrote her all them love letters. And then ask the brother," he swung to Simon. "Ask Simon Harper what he and Wendell were screaming about by the corral the very hour Wendell rode off and broke his neck. Ask him if it wasn't over her. Ask him whether his brother's death was as clean as he tells it. You want a forger, fine. But you're sitting in church defending a man who wrote love letters to his brother's bride and had his brother in the ground inside the month." The church went cold. Marjorie felt it go, felt the tide that had turned toward them, shudder and hang, felt every eye swing to Simon, and she felt Simon beside her stop breathing, felt him start to fold under it, the way he'd folded under it every day for a week, ready to stand there and eat the lie, because he half believed the truth underneath it was worse. "It's true about the letters," Simon said, and his voice was wrecked. "I wrote them. God help me, that part's true. Don't." Marjorie's hand caught his arm. "I wrote them, and my brother found out, and we fought, and he rode off, and he died, and Crandall's right. It's my—" "Simon, stop." And then Marjorie Hale turned around and faced the whole church, and she did the bravest thing she had ever done in her life, which was to hand these people the truth before Crandall could sell them the lie. "He wrote the letters," she said, and her voice did not shake. "Every word. That's so. Wendell Harper couldn't write, and he wanted a wife, and he asked his brother to help him keep the one who'd answered his advertisement, and Simon started out writing for Wendell, and somewhere in 11 months he ended up writing for himself, and he never told me, and I crossed a continent in love with a man whose name was on the letters, and whose heart was not. Every ugly piece of it Mr. Crandall just handed you is true." She swept the room with her eyes, Mrs. Pruitt and the clerk, and all of them, and she did not let a single one look away. And here is what he left out, because it doesn't serve him. Those letters were the only kindness a man ever showed me in 34 years. I was a woman nobody wrote to, nobody looked at twice, and somebody out here across 2,000 miles in the dark at a kitchen table took the trouble to notice I had a mind and a soul, and to tell me so. Whatever name was signed at the bottom that was real. I have read those letters 100 times looking for the lie in them, and there is no lie in them. There is only a good and cowardly man who couldn't find the courage to sign his own name to his own heart. That is not a sin worth a stoning, Reverend. I've heard your sermon on that this very morning. Nobody moved. Even Crandall had gone still. And as for Wendell, Marjorie's voice caught just once, and she let it, because it was true, and true things are allowed to catch. Wendell Harper found out his brother loved the woman he'd sent for, and he was hurt, and he was angry as any man would be, and he threw down his hat and he rode off too fast and too blind, and the wash took him. That is a grief. It is the worst grief this family has. But it is not a murder, and any one of you who lets Lyle Crandall make it one to save his own forging neck will answer for it to the same God the Reverend's been quoting all morning. Wendell died of an accident and a broken heart, and his own hard pride, and his brother has been dying a little every day since of carrying it, and I will not stand in this church and let a swindler use a dead man. I have grieved and a live man. I have BC. Home. She stopped. The word had come right up to the edge of her, and she caught it just before it fell, and the whole church heard her catch it, and Simon Harper beside her heard it most of all. A live man I have come to know. Marjorie finished quieter. To be honest and gentle, and worth 10 of the man trying to ruin him. She turned back to Crandall. Sign the paper, Mr. Crandall. You've played your last card, and this whole town watched it fall flat. There's nobody left in this room believes you but you. And it was true. She could see it in their faces. The tide had come back in and harder now because a valley that will believe the worst of a stranger will turn on a cheat twice as fast once it feels it's been played for a fool. Mrs. Pruitt was looking at Crandall as though she'd found a hair in her soup. The mercantile clerk had gone pale. And then a voice spoke up from the back of the church, a rancher named Del Farrow, weathered, plain-spoken, a man Marjorie had never met. Crandall padded my note too, Farrow said, standing slow, his hat in his hands. Told me I owed $420. I never signed for, but $380. I paid the difference 2 years running 'cause I couldn't figure how to argue with a man in a broadcloth coat. He looked at Marjorie, then at the 2 papers on the pew. Reckon I can figure it now. And mine, said another man. And the widow Cole's, said a woman. She lost her 40 acres to that man. Lost it and moved to her sister's in shame and told everybody it was her own bad management 'cause who'd believe her over him. It came apart for Lyle Crandall. Then all at once the way a dam comes apart, not with a crack, but with the whole weight of the water it had been holding back. One after another, they stood the people he'd shaved and patted and quietly robbed for years, while they blamed themselves in silence, and the room filled up with it, and Crandall stood in the middle of the flood he'd made, and understood at last that he was finished in Wheeler's Crossing. You'll sign the Harper's paper, Reverend Sykes said into the noise, and the noise fell for him. You'll sign it now at 8% on 600 with honest time. And then you and I are going to sit down with every soul in this valley you've cheated, and you're going to make it right to the last penny. Or as God is my witness, Lyle, I will drive you to the sheriff myself in my own buggy and testify against you with my own mouth. The dry ledger of his face had shut again, but it had shut on the right man this time. You came into my church to shame a widow. You've shamed yourself in front of your whole town instead. That's a mercy you didn't earn. Take it. Crandall took the pen. He signed the Harper's paper with a hand that was no longer soft or steady, and the Reverend Sykes witnessed it, and it was done, and the ranch was saved. Saved. Not with money the Harpers didn't have, but with a truth. Marjorie had refused to stop reading, and Lyle Crandall walked out of the church, a smaller man than he'd walked into it. His 2 hired hands not even following him now, and the town he'd bought and frightened for years. Let the doors swing shut behind him, without one soul rising to see him off. The Reverend Sykes set down the 2 papers, and he turned, and in front of his whole congregation, he did a thing Marjorie had not expected and would not soon forget. He bowed his head to her, the small, stiff bow of a proud man doing a hard thing in public because he'd be twice the coward to do it in private. This morning, Sykes said loud enough to carry to the back pew, I stood in that pulpit and preached at this woman about stones and sinners, and I meant her to feel every word of it. I owe her an apology, and I'll not shrink it down by making it quiet. Miss Hale, I judged you by the talk of this town, and the talk of this town turned out to be the voice of a thief covering his tracks. I was a fool in God's own house, and you were the one soul standing in it telling the truth. I am sorry. He straightened. There's a seat in this congregation for you, as long as you care to sit in it, and any man or woman here who says otherwise can take it up with me directly. Mrs. Pruitt looked as though she'd swallowed a stone of her own. It should have felt like triumph, and for the crowd it did. There was a rising murmur of it, people turning to each other, the widow Cole's name being said with a new shame that wasn't hers to carry anymore. But Marjorie Hale stood at the front of that church and did not feel triumphant. She felt scraped hollow, wrung dry, and she felt the thing she'd almost said still hanging in the air where she'd caught it, and she could not look at Simon, because she knew if she looked at him now in front of all of them, her face would say the word her mouth had swallowed. The congregation began to move to break into knots to come toward them, Del Ferro with his hand out to Simon. Mrs. Pruitt, hovering with the mortified look of a woman rearranging her opinion of you in real time, and hoping you won't mention how it stood an hour ago. And in the middle of all of it, Simon leaned close to Marjorie, so only she could hear his voice unsteady as a boy's. "You stood up in front of the whole town," he said, "and told them the worst thing about me, and made it sound like the only decent thing I ever did." "It might be the only decent thing you ever did," Marjorie said, staring straight ahead at the crowd. "Don't let it go to your head." "Marjorie," his voice cracked on her name, "what you started to say, before you changed it, about the live man you'd come to, I know what I started to say. Were you going to say, Simon Harper?" She finally turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright and furious and full, and her voice dropped so low that even the closest gossip couldn't have caught it. "We have just saved your brother's ranch in front of the entire population of Wheeler's Crossing. Del Ferro is walking over here to shake your hand. Mrs. Pruitt is about to bring us a covered dish 2 weeks too late. This is neither the time nor the place, and I will thank you not to ask a woman what she was going to say in the middle of the church that spent all morning calling her a harlot." She squared her shoulders and put on the face she wore for the world. "Shake the man's hand. We'll talk on the ride home. And Simon—" Her voice softened just a hair's breadth, just enough that only he would ever know it had only on the ride home, not 1 second before. And she turned to greet Del Ferro with her chin up and her hand out, a woman who'd walked into that building an hour ago as the town's disgrace and would walk out of it, whether the town had caught up yet or not, as the only person in it who'd told the whole truth out loud, leaving Simon Harper standing beside her with his heart in his throat and a ride home ahead of him that he already knew he'd remember one way or the other for the rest of his natural life. They didn't say a word until Wheeler's Crossing was a mile behind them. Marjorie sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road, and Simon drove with the reins loose and his jaw tight, and the promise she'd made him hung in the wagon between them like a third passenger. Neither one wanted to be the first to touch. Twice she felt him draw breath to speak. Twice she felt him let it go. "Ask it," she finally said. "You've been chewing on it a mile. Ask it before it chokes you. You said we'd talk on the ride home." "So talk." Simon was quiet another moment. Then, "In the church, you said a live man you'd come to know, but that wasn't the word coming. I heard the shape of the word that was coming, Marjorie. So did God and everybody. I'm not fool enough to think I imagined it." He kept his eyes on the horses. "I need to know if it was real, or if it was just the fight talking. If you only said the front half of it because you couldn't stand to let Crandall win, and the back half was going to be a lie you'd have taken back the minute we got clear. You want to know if I love you." He flinched at the word, said plain. "Yes, God help me. Yes." Marjorie looked at the road a long time. "Here's the truth, Simon, and it's not the shape you're hoping for, so brace up." She turned to look at him. 2 weeks ago, I loved a man named Wendell Harper with everything I had. I loved him so hard I sold my mother's sewing table and crossed a continent for him. And that man never existed. You made him up letter by letter, and I gave my whole heart to a thing you invented, and then you let me grieve his grave for 4 days before you told me the man I loved was you. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. Now you want me to just turn from loving the ghost to loving the man who wore the ghost's face. Same heart, new name. Like changing the address on an envelope. She shook her head. It doesn't work like that. A heart's not a letter. You can't cross out one name and write another and send it on. Simon's hands had gone white on the reins. Then there's no... I didn't say that." She cut him off, not unkind. "I said it's not simple, and you'd best stop looking for it to be. What I feel for you, I don't have a clean word for it yet. It's got your kindness in it, the real kind, the kind I've watched you show a dozen times this week when there was no letter to hide behind. And it's got a year of your words in it that I can't unread and don't want to. But it's also got a dead man in it, Simon. Every time I look at you, I see the grave you dug, and the brother you lost, and the 4 days you let me weep for the wrong man. That's all in there too. And I'll not stand in front of a preacher and pretend it isn't just because it'd be easier for the both of us. I don't want easy," Simon said. "I never once had easy. I want—" He stopped and steadied himself and said it lower. "I want you to be able to look at me one day and not see the grave first. That's all I want. I don't even need to be loved, Marjorie. I've gone 30 years unloved, and I know how to do it. I just don't want to be the thing that ruined you. I've got enough ruin on my hands. And that the plainness of it, the man asking for so little when she'd braced for him to demand so much that undid her worse than any pretty speech could have. That's the difference," she said quietly. "Do you know that between now and the letters, in the letters, you always knew the beautiful thing to say. Just now you said the true one instead. And it wasn't beautiful, it was just true. And it went straight through me in a way none of that poetry ever did." She faced forward again. "Keep doing that. That's the only thing that's going to save you with me, Simon Harper. Not the words. You've got too many words. Give me the ugly true ones from here on, and let me decide what they're worth. No more deciding for me what I can bear to hear. No more," Simon said. "I swear it. On—" He caught himself before he said "on my brother's grave," and she saw him catch it, and saw him choose a different oath. "On my own name, the one I should have signed all along." They rode the rest of the way with something eased between them, not mended, but eased, and when they came into the yard, there was a strange horse tied at the rail, and Amos Teal sitting on the porch step with a letter in his hand, and a look on his old face. "Ryder brought this from town while you was at church," Amos said, holding it up. "From back east. Come for you, Miss Hale. I signed for it." He squinted. "Feels like there's more'n paper in it." Marjorie took the letter. She knew the hand before she'd read a word of it, her sister's cramped, careful script, the same hand that had begged her not to go. She broke the seal and read and stood very still, and Simon watched the color move in her face. "What is it?" he said. Marjorie didn't answer right off. When she did, her voice was strange. "My sister heard I'd been widowed before the wedding. Word travels even 2,000 miles. She's beside herself. She says, 'Come home, don't you dare stay out there alone among strangers. There's nothing for you there,' and she sent—" She reached into the envelope and drew out folded bills and held them up between 2 fingers so Simon could see. "Rail fare. Enough to bring me home. All the way home and some over for the trip." The yard went quiet. Amos looked from the money to Simon to Marjorie and had the sense for once to say nothing, and Marjorie watched it happen on Simon's face. Watched him understand that the thing he'd offered her in the dark through a pine wall, the open door the train had just become real in her hand. 2 weeks ago she'd had $4.60 and no way home, and she'd stayed because she was trapped. Now she had a way. Now for the first time staying would be a thing she chose, and leaving would be a thing she chose. And there was no poverty left to make the choice for either of them. "Well," Simon said, and his voice came out rough and even. "Then it's like I told you. Say the word and I'll hitch the fresh horse and have you at the depot by dark. Your sister's right. You've got kin that loves you, and a home that's yours, and no reason on this earth to spend your one life among strangers on account of a mess a Harper made." He turned toward the barn because he could not stand there and look at her while he said it. "I'll get the horse." "Simon, it's the right thing, Marjorie. Might be the first right thing I've—" Simon Harper stopped walking. He stopped. He didn't turn. "You just promised me not 10 minutes ago on that road the ugly true words from here on out," Marjorie said. "So turn around and give me one. Don't hitch a horse to be noble. Don't hand me back to my sister so you can feel like you did right by me. Turn around and tell me the true thing. Do you want me to take that train?" For a long moment, Simon Harper stood with his back to her, and Amos Teal held his breath on the step, and the old dog looked between them all. Then Simon turned around, and his face was wide open, wrecked and honest. No letter to hide behind, no brother's name to sign. "No," he said. "God forgive me, no. I don't want you on that train. I want you to stay. I want you to stay so bad I can't hardly breathe around it, and I've got no right to it, and I'll drive you to that depot anyhow if it's what you want, because your wanting matters more than mine. But you asked me for the true word, and there it is. I don't want you to go. I never wanted anything less in my life than I want you to get on that train." Marjorie folded the bills back into the envelope slow. "That," she said, "is the first thing you've said today that I fully believed." She tucked the letter into her pocket. "I'm not getting on the train, Simon. Not today. Maybe not ever. I haven't decided, and I won't be rushed to it, and you're going to have to live with not knowing for a good while yet." She looked up into his face. "But I'll tell you what I have decided. A woman who'd choose a train and a safe small life over a hard true one out here. That woman died on a platform 2 weeks ago, same as I keep telling you. I don't care to dig her back up. Now." She drew a breath. "There's a thing I need to do before I decide anything at all. And I need you to do it with me. Anything. Take me to Wendell." Simon went still. To his grave. She said it gentle but firm. "I've been in this house near 2 weeks, and I have not once stood at that man's grave because for 4 days I thought I was grieving him, and then I found out I was grieving you, and I got so tangled in which man I'd lost, that I never once grieved the man who's actually dead. Wendell Harper, who couldn't write his own name and wanted a wife so bad he borrowed against his land to build her rooms. Who chose my letter out of 40 because I wrote about a book." Her voice caught, and she let it. "That man deserves to be grieved by the woman he sent for. His own self. Not the ghost you made, and not the brother I'm tangled up with. Him. And I can't decide one thing about you, or me, or that train, until I've stood at his grave and made it right with him. Will you take me?" Simon Harper's eyes had filled. "He'd have liked you, Marjorie. The real you. More than the letters even. That's the thing I never got to tell him. That he chose better than he knew." "Then let's go tell him now," she said. "Both of us. Come on." They walked out behind the house to the cottonwood, the two of them, and the old dog trailing after, and they stood at the low mound where Wendell Harper lay under a plain marker. Simon had cut himself, and for a while nobody said anything at all. Then Marjorie spoke to the grave. "I'm Marjorie," she said, plain the way you'd introduce yourself to a man at a door. "I'm the woman you rode away for. I want you to know I came. I know I came too late, and I know by the time I got here, everything had gone wrong that could. But I came Wendell Harper. I crossed the whole country to be your wife, and I'd have been a good one, and I'm sorry I never got to prove it to you." Her voice thickened. "And I want you to know something else because your brothers too broke up to say it right, and somebody ought to. You didn't fail. You wanted a wife, and you were ashamed you couldn't write her, and there's not one shameful thing in that. A man who'd borrow against his own land to build rooms for a woman he'd never met, that's not a man who failed at love. That's a man who was better at it than most who can spell. You just didn't have the words, so you borrowed your brothers." She wiped her face. "And I know that's what got twisted, and I know it cost you everything, and I am so sorry for it. But I'll not let it make you small. You were a good man who loved bigger than his own 2 hands could carry. I'll remember you for that. I'll see to it this whole valley remembers you for that. Not for how you died, for what you were reaching for when you did." Beside her, Simon had gone down on one knee in the dirt, his hat off his head bowed, and his shoulders were shaking. "I'm sorry, Wendell," he said so low, Marjorie almost didn't hear it. "I've said it every day since, and I'll say it every day I've got left. I never meant to take her from you. She was so, and I was weak, and I'll keep paying for it. And I don't ask you to forgive me because I can't forgive myself. But I'll keep your land. I'll keep your name good in this valley. And whatever happens with her brother, I'll see she's cared for because you loved her first and you loved her true. And that's a debt of yours. I mean to pay if it takes my whole life." And then Amos Teal, who'd come up quiet behind them, cleared his old throat. "He knew," Amos said. Simon looked up. "What?" "Wendell. He knew at the end that she'd choose you if she ever met the both of you." Amos turned his hat in his hands, his ruined face working. "I never told you, 'cause I didn't want to make the burying harder. But that morning before the fight, before any of it, Wendell and me was mending the corral, and he got to talking about the letters, about how they'd got so fine lately he could hardly believe his luck. And he says to me, 'Amos, you reckon a woman with a mind like that would really want a man like me, a man who can't read her own letters back to her?'" Amos's voice cracked. "And I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. And he laughed kind of sad. And he says I got a feeling when she meets me she's going to figure out real quick which brother she was really writing to. Then the fight happened, not an hour later, and I figured he'd just been talking himself into his own hurt the way a man does." Amos looked at Simon. "But I've turned it over 100 nights since, and I don't think he rode into that wash blind with rage, son. Heartbroke, sure. Any man would be. But a piece of him already knew and had already not made peace. That's too much, but seen it coming. He wasn't surprised by what he found in your coat. He was just finally sure of a thing he'd feared a good while. That don't make it your fault he died. A grieving man rode too fast. That's all it ever was. But he didn't die hating you, Simon. He died knowing you. There's a difference, and you've earned the right to hear it." Simon Harper knelt in the dirt at his brother's grave and wept like Marjorie had not seen a man weep, and she did not try to stop him or fix it. She came and stood beside him and put her hand on his bowed head, in his hair, the way you'd steady a child, and she let him have it. She let him have the whole thing at last. The grief he'd been holding sideways for 2 weeks, so it wouldn't spill on her, she let it spill. When it had passed, and he'd got to his feet and wiped his face rough with his sleeve, Marjorie was still holding the sister's letter in her pocket, and she took it out, and she looked at it a moment. Then she tore it in half. Not the money, she was too poor and too sensible to tear money, but the letter itself. Her sister's careful begging script she tore in two and let the halves fall. "Marjorie," Simon said. "That was your sister's." "I'll write her a new one," Marjorie said. "A true one. I'll tell her I'm staying in Wheeler's Crossing at least the season at least, till I know my own mind. And that I'm not alone among strangers. And that the man I'm staying near is a good man who did a terrible thing and is spending his whole self trying to make it right. And that her little sister is not the timid shop clerk she waved off at the depot anymore." She met Simon's eyes. "And I'll sign my own name to it plain, no ghost, no borrowing. Seems to me this family's got a bad habit of the wrong name on the letter. I mean to break it. Break." They walked back to the house together, and the light was going, and the day that had started with a sermon meant to shame her was ending with her hand brushing Simon Harper's as they walked, not held, not yet just brushing, and neither of them pulling away. There was still the honest debt. Still $350 where $600 needed to be, and Crandall's honest terms bought them time, but not a miracle. But when they came round the front of the house, there were 3 wagons in the yard that hadn't been there before. Del Farrow got down off the first one. Behind him were 2 other ranchers Marjorie half recognized from the church, and the widow Cole's brother, and a couple of hands. "Heard tell you're short on your note?" Farrow said, thumbing his hat back. "And heard tell you got cattle scattered from here to the county line you can't gather alone before the drive." He spat not unkindly. "That woman of yours stood up in a church today and read the truth off 2 papers when not one of us had the spine to do it in 10 years. Cost her doing that. Cost her good name to save the rest of ours." He looked at Marjorie and touched his hat to her slow and deliberate. "A valley that had let the 2 of you lose this ranch, after that ain't a valley worth living in. So we come to help gather and to drive to the railhead with you. And Ott here." He nodded at one of the men. "Ott's got 150 put by. He'll loan against your fall calves. Honest terms. 8% wrote plain, since we all learned this morning what happens to a man's numbers when he gets greedy." Simon Harper stood in his own yard and could not speak. So Marjorie spoke for him the way she'd been speaking for him all day, only this time it came easy. "We'd be much obliged, Mr. Farrow," she said. "All of you. We surely would." And Del Farrow grinned, and the men started climbing down, and Amos Teal let out a whoop that startled the horses, and the old dog barked for the first time in 2 weeks, and Simon finally found his voice enough to start shaking hands and saying names. And Marjorie stood on the porch step and watched the yard fill up with the very people who'd whispered about the width of her not 14 days back, come now to save the roof over her head because she'd been brave enough to read out loud. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the torn halves of her sister's letter and the whole of the rail fare, and she knew standing there that she was not going to spend that money on a train. She'd send it back, or spend it on cattle, or keep it against a hard winter. But she was not leaving. She'd known it, she supposed, since the dark of the porch the night Crandall rode off, and Simon caught her before she fell. She'd known it, and not said it because she'd wanted to be sure she was choosing it free. And now she was freer than she'd been in her whole life, with Kin's money in her pocket and a train she could catch by dark. And she was choosing this. This yard, this work, this valley, this hard, true, unfinished thing with a man who'd finally learned to hand her the ugly truth instead of the beautiful lie. She hadn't forgiven him. Not all the way. There was a grave under the cottonwood that would sit between them a while yet, and she was in no hurry to pretend otherwise. But she'd stopped seeing the grave first. Somewhere on the ride home, somewhere between the church and the cottonwood, and the torn letter she'd started seeing the man. And that she thought watching Simon Harper laugh in his own yard for the first time since she'd known him was where a thing like this had to start. The drive took 9 days, and Marjorie rode every mile of it. She'd never sat a horse before Wheeler's Crossing. And she sat one badly for the first 3 days, and less badly after, and Del Farrow said she had the worst seat and the best head he'd ever seen on a green rider, and she took it for the compliment it was. They pushed the gathered Harper cattle north to the railhead, with the whole makeshift crew of neighbors, and they sold at a fair price, and Marjorie stood at the buyer's table and read every figure before Simon signed, because some habits a woman keeps for good reason. The night they got back, Simon rode into Wheeler's Crossing alone and laid honest money on Lyle Crandall's desk. The full $600 paid off early, with Ott's loan, and the drive money together, and made Crandall sign the note, canceled in front of the Reverend Sykes a second time, so there'd be no forgetting it. Crandall signed with a dead face, and left the county inside the month run out, not by law, but by a valley that had finally learned to read him. Nobody wept to see him go. The widow Cole came back from her sister's before the first snow, and through it all, something between Marjorie and Simon Harper kept turning slow, like a key finding the shape of a lock. It was not sudden. She'd told him it wouldn't be, and it wasn't. There were days she still couldn't look at him without the cottonwood rising up between them. Days she went short with him over nothing, because the nothing was really the letters, really the 4 days, really the grave. And Simon took it. Every time. He'd learned that a man who's done a great wrong doesn't get to decide when he's done paying, and he never once asked her to hurry, and that patience did more to earn him back than any word he'd ever written. Still, the season gave them small mercies. One evening on the drive, saddle-sore and dust-caked, Marjorie sat by the crew's fire and found Simon settling down beside her with 2 tin cups of coffee, and he handed her one without a word. And she took it without a word, and Del Farrow watched the whole silent transaction and grinned into his own cup. "You two," Farrow said. Never met a courting couple said less and meant more. "We ain't courting," Marjorie said. "No, ma'am?" Farrow's grin widened. "My mistake." Simon said nothing, but Marjorie caught the corner of his mouth twitch, and she found to her own surprise that she was fighting her own, and she looked hard into the fire so he wouldn't see it win. Later, when the crew was asleep, and only the 2 of them sat up with the herd, Simon said quiet, "You laughed today, when the roan bolted and Amos went after it hollering. First time I ever heard you laugh out loud." "Was it?" "I've been counting," Simon admitted. "Everyone. Ain't got past the 1 yet." He turned his cup in his hands. "Figure the day I get to 100, I'll be the richest man in the territory." She didn't answer that because there wasn't a safe thing to say to it. But she didn't move away from him either, and they sat the rest of the watch, shoulder to shoulder in the dark, saying nothing, which had somehow become the most either of them had ever said. Then came the day late in the gather for winter feed, when Marjorie learned exactly how much she'd come to fear losing him. A green horse threw Simon against the corral rails hard, and he went down and didn't get up, and Amos hollered, and Marjorie was across that yard before she knew she'd moved Marjorie, who 2 months back could barely climb into a wagon down on her knees in the dirt with his gray face in her 2 hands, saying his name like it was the only word she had. Simon, Simon Harper, you look at me. You open your eyes and look at me right now, do you hear? His eyes came open, dazed but open. He got a breath. I'm all right. Wind's knocked out, that's all. That is not all. Her voice broke clean apart, and she didn't care who heard it, Amos or the hands or God himself. You went down, and you didn't move, and I thought, Simon, and then it came out of her, the whole thing, right there on her knees in the dirt, with her hands shaking against his jaw, because a body only holds a truth back so long before a scare shakes it loose. I forgive you, do you hear me? I forgive you all of it. The letters, and the 4 days, and every last piece of it. I forgive you. I've been forgiving you for weeks, and too stubborn to say it, and I'll not have you die before I got the words out. So don't you dare leave me with the words still in my mouth like your brother did. Simon Harper lay in the dirt with the wind half back in him, and looked up at the woman weeping over him. And whatever he'd expected out of his life, it had never once been this. Say it again, he whispered. The forgive part. Say it when I ain't half dead so I know it's real. Simon. Please. His hand came up unsteady and covered one of hers against his face. I've waited 2 months to hear it. Let me hear it standing up. So she helped him up, him leaning on her. The 2 of them crooked and clumsy, and both of them crying now, and neither ashamed of it. And she stood him against the corral rail that had near killed him. And she took his battered face in her hands again, and she said it plain in daylight, sober and sure. I forgive you, Simon Harper, for all of it. It's done. It's laid down. I'm not carrying it another day, and neither are you. And Simon Harper put his forehead against hers and shook, and Amos Teal turned away to give them the moment and blew his ruined nose like a trumpet, and the hands found somewhere else to look. And for the first time since a stranger walked toward a woman on a train platform, with grief on his shoulders, there was no grave standing between them at all. But Simon did not kiss her then, though she half thought he might. He held her a long moment, and then he stepped back, and there was something working in his face, some decision. Not yet, he said low. There's one thing I've got to do first. One thing I've owed you since before you ever got here. And he wouldn't say what only made her promise to leave him be for the evening, and he shut himself in the house with the lamp burning long after she'd gone to the little room, and through the wall, the same 3 inches of pine. She heard the old sound, the one she knew better than any sound on earth. She heard a pen scratching. In the morning, there was a letter on the kitchen table. It was folded the way the 41 had been folded, and her name was on the front in the hand she'd have known blind in the dark at the bottom of the sea, the hand that had reached across 2,000 miles and taught a lonely woman she had a soul worth noticing. She sat down slow. She unfolded it. Dear Marjorie. It read, This is the 42nd letter I have written you, and the first one true. There is no other name it could be signed with. There is no brother to hide behind, no advertisement, no lie. It is only me at this table where I wrote all the others telling you the one thing I never had the courage to write plain, that a man sat here 11 months falling in love with a woman he'd never met, one letter at a time, and was too much a coward to sign his own name to his own heart. That was the whole of my sin. Not that the love was false, that I was afraid to own it. I am not afraid now. I love you. I have loved you since the night you wrote me about the storm and asked, did I ever feel like the only waking soul in the world, and I answered you as myself for the first time and could not stop. Everything since has only made it worse and truer and more my own. I know what I cost you. I know I've got no right to ask. but I am asking anyway out loud in my own name. In the light, Marjorie Hale, will you marry me? Not the ghost, not my brother. Me, Simon Harper, the one who should have signed it all along. She read it 3 times. Then she stood up and folded it and walked out to the yard where Simon Harper was standing by the corral rail, waiting for her with his hat in his hands and his whole life in his eyes, and she did not say a word. She just walked up to him close, and she reached up and took his face in her hands, the way she'd been taking it lately, and she kissed him. Kissed him full and sure. A woman who'd crossed a continent for love and been made a fool of and buried the wrong man and read a swindler to ruin in a church and forgiven the unforgivable and earned dollar by dollar and day by day and truth by truth. The right to choose exactly this. And when she finally drew back, she kept his face in her hands and looked him dead in the eye. 42 letters, Marjorie said, and it only took you the one honest one. She smiled and it went all the way up. Yes, Simon Harper. In your own name. In the light. Yes. They were married quietly at Wheeler's Crossing 3 weeks later by the Reverend Sykes, who'd asked for the honor himself and would take no for an answer from anyone. Half the valley came the same valley that had counted her chins on a platform in the spring, and this time nobody counted anything but their blessings. Amos Teal walked her down the aisle, scrubbed pink and stuffed into a collar that near choked him because she'd asked him to, and there was no kin of hers within 2,000 miles, and the old man cried so hard he could barely get her to the front and told her twice on the short walk that Wendell would have busted with pride and that he, Amos, had never in 70 years been asked to do a finer thing. Mrs. Pruitt brought a cake and cried through the whole ceremony and told anyone who'd listen that she'd known there was quality in that girl the moment she laid eyes on her, which was a lie, and which Marjorie let her have, because a woman can afford to be generous on the day she marries the man she loves. They did not hide Wendell. They did the opposite. Marjorie had asked for that, and Simon had wept at the asking, and so before they spoke their vows, the Reverend Sykes stood up in front of the whole town and told the truth of it, plain that Wendell Harper had wanted a wife, and hadn't the words, and that his brother had written them, and that it had gone wrong the way love and pride and silence make things go wrong, and that a good man had died of it. And then Marjorie herself, standing in her wedding collar with her chin up, told them the rest, that Wendell Harper had loved bigger than his 2 hands could carry, and had borrowed his brother's words to reach a woman across a continent, and that in a way she could never fully untangle and had stopped trying to. She'd been sent for by one brother and loved by the other, and grieved them both, and that she meant to carry Wendell's name in her mouth with honor every day of the life she was about to begin. There wasn't a dry eye under the cottonwood where they'd chosen to say the vows so that the one Harper who couldn't be there could be there after all. That evening, when the last wagon had rolled home and the yard was quiet, Marjorie found Simon standing at his brother's grave with 2 glasses and a bottle he'd been saving. "Figured he ought to drink to it," Simon said thick. It was his advertisement started the whole thing. Man deserves a toast at the wedding he set in motion, even if it didn't come out the way any of us drew it up. Marjorie took the glass. She looked at the plain marker at the name Simon had cut with his own hands. "To Wendell Harper," she said, "who couldn't write a word and reached a woman 2,000 miles off anyhow. There's not a man alive who ever loved braver than that." "To Wendell," Simon said, and his voice held this time. "Brother, I kept the land. I kept your name good, and I'll spend my life keeping her happy, which is the one thing you'd have wanted most and the one thing I can actually do." He drank. "Rest easy. We're all right now, all 3 of us some way. We're all right." And they poured the last of the glass onto the grave and stood there a while in the settling quiet, the new wife and the new husband and the brother who'd started it all, and then Simon Harper took Marjorie's hand, not brushing it now, not almost, but holding it whole and sure, and they walked back together to the house he'd built, room by room, for a woman he'd summoned in another man's name, and that was hers now in his own. 2,000 miles she had crossed for a man she never met, and lost him before she arrived, and found in his place a lie, a grave, and a brother she had every reason to hate. And out of all of it, out of the worst month of her life, and the best out of the deception and the debt and the swindler and the whispering town, Marjorie Harper built the one thing she'd stopped believing the world would ever let her have. Not the love she came for, the love she was meant for. And no distance, no grave, no lie, and no lonely year behind any counter on this earth had been able to keep it from her in the end, because a heart that had spent 34 years learning to read had finally at long last read itself all the way home.